In this episode, I am once again joined by Dr. Ben Joffe, anthropologist, occultist, and scholar practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism. Dr. Joffe leads a deep dive into the topic of divination, explores its underlying mechanisms and practical methods, and compares different cultural understandings of the practice. Dr. Joffe details his understanding of the tarot as a scholar and a reader, shares his advice for those who wish to learn the system, and reveals how to use tarot for information gathering, sorcery, and magical workings. Dr. Joffe also reflects on his own journey as a tarot reader, addresses criticisms that tarot and other psychic methods are exploitative, and considers the uneasy relationship between divination and licensed counselling. So without further ado, Dr. Ben Joffe. Dr. Ben Joffe, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so delighted to be talking with you yet again. Who could have seen this coming?
I know, right?
Well, I tell you who might have seen it coming, a diviner. And that's our topic of conversation today, divination. In our previous episodes, we've covered so many different subjects. We began, actually, with a series of episodes all about your PhD thesis about the Nagpa. We've talked about the occult in its very different facets of Western occultism. We've talked about Karma Mudra in a, at that time, I think, record-length episode, appropriately enough, entitled Coitus Reservatus. And we really did keep it.
We never reached the climax, did we?
Indeed, maybe multiple, but we kept it going for a long time. And most recently, we talked about spirit relationships. We did a series of, I think, a pair of podcasts looking at spirit relationships, or beginning to look at spirit relationships and comparing the various different traditions that you have scholarly and personal experience of. And that was also very, very fascinating indeed. So I've managed to convince you to come back, and that's always a great pleasure for me when you do come back. And today we're going to talk about divination. Divination. Now, I thought I'd begin by quoting back to you a couple of snippets from the exchange, voice note exchange we had when we were preparing for this conversation. And so here it goes. You said, by its nature, divination is organic and can take many forms. I have experimented with the limits of form versus function. I genuinely believe that if you have a suitable, ad hoc, divinatory frame, you can get powerful results regardless of the means you're using. So you're speaking there to the essence, I suppose, of divination. What is its mechanism? Is it a mechanical process? A set of correspondences, for example, that anyone can learn? Is it an innate talent, an intuition that one's born with? Is it a cultivated city skill that a muggle, using the right methods of meditation, for example, or other means, could cultivate a kind of capacity for it, a trait of maybe even of divination? Is that sort of a thing possible? I'd like us to begin there. If I ask you this very difficult question, I know. What is divination really?
Great. Yeah, I've obviously, like I was saying to you, thought about this a lot. As someone who's been practicing divination, I don't want to use the word professionally because no one certified me. I started reading when I was 10 years old and quickly began reading for clients, and I've read for hundreds, thousands of people since then. And also I've been thinking about this as a scholar, as an anthropologist who has a deep interest in divination in different times and places. And so the kind of simple, like Oxford Dictionary definition of divination would be that it's a set of techniques or procedures which are used to glean some kind of information, some sort of hidden information. Typically, it's thought of as fortune telling, as understanding what might happen in the future. But it can also be very often it's not really primarily about the future. It's about the present and also the past. So I think it would be more fair to say that divination, in English, when we say we divine something, it means we guess. In many languages, the word for guessing is pretty much the same as the word for divining. We attempt to uh, see patterns and understand connections in a way we couldn't by using other means. And those means, I think, to answer your question, the first thing we have to understand is that the different techniques of divination, even within one society, tend to be so diverse and tend to be surprisingly unconservative. What's so interesting as an anthropologist studying divination is that divination develops and grows. Often individual shamans and healers develop or transform the traditional systems of divination. Divination seems by its nature to be open to this kind of development. Um, you can find there really is no kind of limit or consistency in terms of what can be done to perform divination. Often there are patterns. So, I think some dictionary definitions will say that divination is about creating some kind of simulating randomness or creating some kind of ritualized randomness, be that the shuffling of cards or the drawing, the casting and then drawing of lots or the rolling of a dice or die, the throwing of bones. Uh, there's always an element of randomness in the divinatory process, but the idea is that from randomness emerges some kind of synchronicity, some kind of pattern, some kind of correlation. And that randomness also appears in examples like our ancient ancestors looking up at the pattern of the scattering of the stars in the sky and in perceiving shapes and figures and seeing in that seemingly random display vital forces, movements, life itself. Um, uh, so when I said in my voice notes to you that I think divination is an organic process, I think, I mean, there's a lot hiding behind that statement that we could talk about. But when the average human being looks around himself in the world, they see many things, right? Um, they see a constant flow of forces and conditions and correlations and patterns and structures appearing and dissolving, and their mind attempts to make sense of that, to project meaning onto that. We do it with language. As children, we're sort of constantly assaulted by a maelstrom of sensory information, and we have to categorize that and attempt to guess where these patterns and flows might lead in the microcosm of our own body, in our immediate environment, and then in the broader world in terms of our relational dynamics. And so part of what that snippet was that I was saying to you was that I think that like we can talk about how in different cultural contexts or in different time periods, certain systems of divination became institutionalized or formalized and become really beautiful artifacts of culture and practice, like really complex. The divinatory systems tend to be saturated with like generations worth of values and knowledge and storytelling. And I love studying divinatory systems because they are so rich and they tend to connect to so many other areas of life and experience. And they tend to also be highly valued by the communities that have produced them, even if those communities are now no longer live in connection with the sort of the circumstances that gave rise to some of that wisdom. The divinatory systems often get retained over long periods of time, even if in a really sort of impoverished form. So, what is divination? Well, as a as a Buddhist, I think what I would say is that part of the reason why divination is organic and inevitable, to my mind, is because of the Buddhist truth of interdependence. Um, Nothing has any inherent essence or value or permanent existence, but everything arises through dependent origination. And in fact, in Tibetan, the word for dependent origination, tendril, in Tibetan, is used colloquially to mean an omen, uh, a a divinatory coincidence. So it's right there for you. Divination will never go away. It's almost like a natural impulse. It's almost like something that we devise. The moment we, as a species, start looking around at the world, the moment children begin to sort of tune in to the flow of seemingly random forces and think, where am I situated in this flow, in this unfolding? How can I try to glean some understanding of how one thing connects to another, how one level connects to another, how the causes and conditions from the past and the present are cohering together to create my experience? I see, some people are quite sort of dismissive about divination because it can often look very sort of routinized, mechanized, superstitious. And we can talk about this. Like in my decades of being a reader, I certainly have encountered more than my fair share of people who I think the main advice they need is stop going to diviners, stop leaning on divination to this extent in this way. It's become unhealthy. You've sort of transformed it into something that can be beneficial and useful into something else. That's very much a thing. On the far extreme of this kind of pattern recognition that almost organically arises, I believe, through the reality of interdependence, the inevitability of interdependence, of things being connected to other things, of nothing happening if not because of other things. And the inherent emptiness of things, like the at the far end of a kind of interest in this topic is, what do they call it? Pareidolia? Is that the right term? I'm forgetting now, where you see faces in the clouds, and there's a kind of, is it personality disorder category cluster A, I think? Am I remembering that right? Like paranoid personalities, eccentric, schizoid personalities. Like on one end, you have people who cannot stop themselves from projecting patterns and meaning. It's conspiratorial thinking. I recently watched a ContraPoints video where she was talking about conspiracy thinking, conspiracism, she called it. And she likened it to astrology, saying like, "Whoa, got to be careful. My queer fan base is very invested in astrology." And she said, "No, astrology is great if you understand that it's attempting to find symbolic patterns and give meaning to human experience, but it should know its place. If that mode of thinking is applied to everything, then there can be problems." So on one end we have that, but on the other end, I think there's, as I said, something very natural about the divinatory process, as sort of strange and contrived as divination can seem. I mean, we have so many examples. There's just no end to the forms of divination that people have devised or used, and it's a bit like uh, it's like language, right? Imagine if you're deaf. Uh, if all you need is two deaf people to create a new sign language, that's it. That's the only conditions needed. So I see it as the same way with divination. All you need is a person looking for answers and trying to see things from a different perspective, see the pattern of connection, past, present, and future. And then you need a space, a screen on which to attempt to intuit that. So what I was alluding to in that voice note to you was that, I've spent years sort of studying different divinatory systems, which have their own, often very complex and quite rigid rules and procedures. I've experimented with innovating within that as well. And I've also purposefully like some people really, it's funny when you say what I'm about to say to people in relation to divination, it makes some people really psyched about divination and more interested in it. And then it also disappoints some people too. So I've done readings for people before that were ad hoc. Like I think about a really meaningful reading I did with an ex-boyfriend of mine when we were both a little bit tipsy at a party, and it was late. This ex of mine is also quite psychic and experienced with divination, but a mutual friend of ours was there, and she said, "Oh, can't you give me a reading, Ben?" And I said, "Well, I don't have my cards with me, and I really don't want to do a reading." But then my ex reminded me, like, "Come on, you know that you can still do a reading for her without your cards." And I was like, "If don't tell her that." Um, and so basically, what happened was we did a reading. It's also the first time I've sort of, not the first time, but it was an interesting example of reading like a tag team reading where we read for her together. So we purposefully made a kind of absurd, invented on the spot ritual procedure. And my ex has kind of scatological humor. So he was like, okay, you have to take this empty beer bottle and you have to put your question and your intention for the reading into the beer bottle, but you have to do it through your pussy and you have to like sit on the bottle. And, like it was a kind of ridiculous thing because there was an audience. And then he's like, okay, give us the bottle. And now we're gonna swish around your intention and your question. And then essentially what we decided, him and I, was that we would read whatever happened to be on the table in front of us at the party, um, as if it was the divinatory assemblage, the constellation of caste, divinatory objects or a symbol set, like you might cast bones or cast a horoscope or something. We said that cigarette stump and the piece of muffin wrapper and somebody's car keys and the bottle cap that were already on the table before the idea even came up to do the reading would be the basis on which we interpreted her question. Um, because I'm a bit more like, I don't know, I'm a bit more of a traditionalist in some ways. To assist me in this more open-ended form of divination, I also expanded it out from the table to everything I could see in the garden at that point in time, where we were sitting outside, and I imagined the 12 houses of astrology as a kind of wheel that would help me have some basis to understand, why that muffin wrapper was there or why that cigarette um, stump was there. And so that gave some sort of pre-projected structure to the randomness. And my ex and I proceeded to do a reading for our friend, which she said was the best reading she'd ever had. Um, there's also a story about Jung, a famous story about Jung, which he tells early in his autobiography. Jung was a natural medium and diviner and fascinated by divination throughout his life. He created a theory of it as a psychologist. And he talks about how he was at a dinner party. I can't remember now if I think there was a pack of tarot cards involved. Somebody produced a pack of tarot cards and then at the dinner party and he sort of laid them out. He didn't know how to read them. And he just laid them out and he just told a story, the first thing that came into his head. And increasingly, the person across from him that he was reading for became more and more angry, um, and sort of red in the face, and eventually sort of told him to stop and got up from the chair and said, "How dare you?" And he was very confused. And he realized that he was just expressing hidden information about this person's life, quite embarrassing hidden information. Jung was just pretending, he was just playing. Um, but then in his play, he hit on some truth. And so that's another feature of divination too that you find across cultural contexts is the idea that almost always the divinatory method, the divinatory symbol set is referred to as a game, either by implication, or often very much literally, most of the classic forms, tools of divination that have become systematized as divinatory languages and procedures often began their life as games. Um, well, it switches both ways. Tarot is my mainstay. We can talk about this, but uh, tarot began as a gambling game, like all cards did, playing cards did, which then developed divinatory. It's hard to know historically. Archaeologists and historians really struggle with this. It seems that the game and the divinatory system are neck and neck. Like it's not always easy to see which one start. It's a chicken and egg kind of situation. And there again is an existential, beautiful, philosophical reason for that. Because what what is all this if not a strange game? What is this if not a game where we sort of understand some of the rules, but there's a wild card element frequently, and some people play well, and then you're progressing in the game, and then you fall down, and then Snakes and Ladders is the board game, was a game about karma, is a game about karma, but many people have now forgotten that. Um, about causality, about interconnectivity, about the randomness of fate, um, uh, the use of buzios, like cowrie shells in Brazil, in Afro-Brazilian religious context, is called a game, the game of the shells. But when people say they had the jogo, the game, they mean that they had a reading, they had a divination. So this is a feature, not a bug, this playful, open-ended quality. So that's kind of what I was alluding to when I said I've experimented with being very innovative, ad hoc, spontaneous, on the spot, and then being very rules-based. One thing that I think we can talk about later is that this is not like an official position, but this is something I've just developed as a sort of scholar practitioner of divination, is that there's really a spectrum with divinatory systems. On the far end, on one side, you have really mechanistic divinatory systems, which are like you plug in. It's really like ancient computing or mathematics, uh, and begins also with binary code. You plug in an input or you receive a result, and then the input can only give rise to certain results, and that's very clear. So the this is another reason why I said divination is sort of cross-cultural, inevitable, and organic, is that eventually everybody discovers the like possibility of flicking a coin, even if they're not using a coin, if it's a sheep knuckle bone. Eventually everyone children come up with this organically in their games. They go, if you fall over this line, then you're dead. you know, if or if you like laugh in response to the statement, then you win. Or I don't know, whatever. They make up conditions, and this is how the divinatory casting works. So that at its most basic level, divination is okay, heads or tails, yes or no, black or white, good or bad, um, and from that develops so much else. Just like with code, just like with language. Um, so much more can be articulated. So many more patterns and combinations and permutations can be produced. So on the one end of the spectrum I was talking about, you have divination that's really mechanistic, and you see this in many cultures. You roll the dice, and then you land on a six, and then you'll have a manual, you'll have a book that like people just pass down that says, okay, if your question was about I've lost an object, will I recover it? And then you roll a six. Then you look, okay, for questions about lost object, if you get a one, it means you'll never get it back ever again. If you get a two, it means um, it's not lost. You misplaced it. Look again. It's the magic eight ball phenomenon. And people often think, oh, well, real divination because anybody can do it. It's mechanistic. It can't be true. Um, and it's interesting because some of the oldest forms of divination we have are very populist. They are really things that anyone can do. For example, really ancient form of divination was bibliomancy, divination where you open like a sacred text or a random book at some point and then just read where your finger lands is the answer to your question. This was done with Homeric materials, and it was also most prominently to this day still done with the Bible. Um, and then on the other end of the spectrum, you have really impressionistic, open-ended divinatory procedures. Probably the most extreme example of that is scrying. So you look at a reflective surface of some kind. You know, most people are familiar with the crystal ball, but it could be a glass or ancient Egyptians used a black painted fingernail, which I love. Um, it could be a candle flame. It could be a bowl of ink or water. It could be the blade of a sword glinting in candlelight. It could be the sky, the expanse of the sky. Tibetan lamas scribe in the sky. The sky like expanse of your mind. That's ultimately where we're scrying all of this, right? So it's like my spectrum in Vajrayana terms is emptiness and there's the emptiness of consciousness out of which all possibilities arise, and then there's also the mechanics of causality. But so I would rank tarot, for example, and I can explain later why. I would rank tarot much more as falling much more toward the end of the open-ended scrying impressionistic side of things. Um, uh, if you look at like Western geomancy or astrology, once certain planets are in certain houses, um, or in particular aspected relationships, there's only a set number of things that could mean. You can't say, oh, it could mean anything. It could be good. The context will determine. Okay, well, let me not derail myself now at this point. This is a nicety of the process of reading. Um, in any divinatory system, things need to mean something specific and fixed. They can't mean anything. They can't be anything. Just like the letter A has to remain A. You don't get to decide it's now da. It has a shape, it has a sound, but how you combine that letter or into words and then subsequently into sentences, you could say almost anything. We can talk more about this, but it is important in any divinatory symbol set that you are clear on what each individual letter of that alphabet is. You can't just change that. And if things fall in a certain place, they have to mean that. But at the same time, every situation, every individual is distinct. What that arrangement pattern of forces will mean, um, will be really idiosyncratic for each client or for each set of circumstances. But what I mean by tracing this spectrum is that there are definitely forms of divination where you are encouraged by the actual kind of structure of the divinatory system itself to be much more, to depend much more on clairvoyance and intuition. And there's a lot more flexibility. You know, if you look at scrying, you have a question and you usually have a ritual environment in which you've often invoked a particular spirit who's going to appear in the mirror or the scrying vessel and give answers, either directly through, its voice or through symbols and what Tibetans call cha, like forms, uh, shapes and forms and visions in the scrying medium or in the mind. Um, I think every form of divination, in like elaborate, high quality divination, will involve some of that mediumistic, clairvoyant, scrying capacity in the diviner. Um, but at the same time, like if we go to the other end of the spectrum, those more mechanistic forms of divination, often they're still accurate. Often they're still useful because what you're trying to do is you're trying to understand. You're appealing to this random assortment of material objects, bones, paper, cards, whatever it might be. Maybe this is not to everyone's taste, but I know some queer men, for example, who every imulk, every Candlemas get together and have a circle jerk, um, where a very friendly circle jerk where they ejaculate onto a ritual mirror and then they take turns reading um, the pattern of semen as a divination for their new year, as friends. But perfectly legitimate system of divination, but by traditional standards, if you ask me. But the point is, you can read anything. You can read anything you like, but there will always be a kind of mechanistic um, process, and you always have to have some kind of framework. You always have to have a set of rules to interpret that display. But you know, sometimes people just have visions and they know what it means intuitively. They have a dream or they see a symbolic display in a scrying vessel and they know individually what that means. But even if you talk to mediums who don't use any form of objects, they don't use any mechanized procedure to read, they will say, oh, I have an internal personal language. So when I see a spirit of a dead person and they tap their wrist as if they're tapping a watch, that's my sign in my system, my idiosyncratic system of reading that says they died prematurely. But for somebody else, or even sometimes for that same medium in a different context, the tapping of the watch might be a reference by the dead person to the fact that they gave their watch, they bequeathed their watch after death to to their loved one who's sitting for the reading. Or it could also mean or it could mean any number of things. So the medium has to decide for themselves individually if what the parameters are. And there's usually some flexibility. I know, mediums will say, this is usually my sign of premature death. But the watch is appearing in my mind in such crystal clear detail that I feel like it's actually about the specific watch. So diviners are always having to muddle their way through a whole lot of data, a whole lot of impressions, sensory information that appears in their own body in an immediate environment, either projected into the cards or the bones or the rice grains or whatever it is, the semen splotches or in their own, unfolding in their own awareness. The process is still the same. There's a passing, and it's what makes divination so alluring, but also unreliable, and at times, or frustrating at times, is that you don't always know at which level to interpret signs. You can try to hone that, you can train that individually. You can try to say, okay, I know that typically for me, I learned through trial and error that this is what this means. There's also a way in which it's easy to get. Divination is all about the relationship, the connection between levels of reality. Sometimes diviners will read something that's meant to be read very literally, like it's a watch. I'm talking about a watch, as if it were about the concept of time, Or they could also do the inverse as well. And this happens a lot. You talk to any practicing diviner, they'll be like, oh, it was actually accurate, but it was on the wrong level of assessment. And this is this is interesting because it tells you something about the divinatory process. it tells you about the meaning making, how that works, how that internally happens. Um, I've become very interested when I was a child. I didn't really think much about why divination worked at first. I just did the procedure and clients were happy with the results. But as time went on, I started sort of observing myself, saying like, how is it that I know what I know? What are these impressions? Where do they exist? Where are they? How do they happen? Where does it come from? I'd be lying if I said I have like a perfect, clear answer to those questions, even now, like 20, almost 30 years later of reading. But as I continue to ask myself, and different diviners and cultures come up with different answers for like where these impressions and this information comes from. The last thing I'll say is another reason why divination and psychic sensitivity feels organic and inevitable to me is that in Buddhist terms, strictly speaking, consciousness, mind itself, is not carved up, is not uh, divided into past, present, or future. It's all pervasive, ungraspable, isn't limited by um, time and space. Uh, and so, as I mentioned earlier, in the scrying mirror of mind, all kinds of information can be gleaned. I think the average diviner, the average person, what we do is pretty humble. I don't claim to have any kind of realization, but I know it's very possible to train, as you were pointing to, in mediumship, to hone clairvoyance. I think to a certain extent there's a natural capacity to sense things about other people, um, in ways that we can't always even explain to ourselves. Like, how did I know that? How did I dream that? How did I feel that? I just knew I knew. Maybe there was something in their body. Maybe there was something in their speech, in their dress that I cold read off of them. Maybe, I've done reading in many contexts. I read for people in person. I read for people over the internet, over the phone. I read remotely for people. So they give me the question and then I just read without ever seeing them or talking to them. And then I just write the answer and send it to them and they tell me whether it was on the mark or useful. And so I do believe, even if I don't understand it, that there is that the world we live in which past, present, and future seem like very distinct categories, uh, isn't really how things are, isn't really how awareness, how our consciousness operates. And so I think that also helps explain how divinatory results are possible, how the divinatory process unfolds. Um, I'm always so appreciative when I'm able to glean information that's useful to clients. This is a whole other point of discussion, but from a professional standpoint, I don't really see divination as being about telling people, as simply being about telling people stuff that they already know, which you couldn't have known any other way. I mean, there's a place for that. Letting people know that you have the ability to ferret out hidden information through, you know, uh, divinatory means for professional diviners. They have to earn trust in the client. In South Africa, it's often the case that Zangoma, ancestral spirit mediums, have to kind of demonstrate some modicum of clairvoyance at the outset. They have to actually be able to correctly explain why the person is there before the session begins. Otherwise, it's kind of like, why would you trust this source of information? But what I've found is that divination, the healing that comes from divination, the benefit that comes from divination is really not just about, a lot of people treat it as entertainment. They're like, wow, that medium knew that I had 3 kids and I'm estranged from one of them. How could they have known that? And it's like, but you knew that already. You knew that before you got there. Who cares that someone else knew it miraculously, supposedly? Like the real issue is what's happening in your life. Um, so this is another thing we could talk about. Like as the years have gone by, I've also decided what I think divination means, most importantly, what it should mean for clients. Because for me, um, I always say this, divinatory methods are intelligence gathering tools. They allow you to see patterns and to understand connections that you couldn't in some other way. They reframe your circumstances. But what's the point of that reframing? Like it, it became endlessly frustrating to me when two things would happen as a child when I saw lots of clients. Um, two things were frustrating. A lot of things were frustrating, but one was people who would come and they would say, they'd sit down and they'd go, "Oh wow, my astrologer told me that 6 months ago. Exactly the same thing." They gave the same advice too. Well, they'd be like, go to this medium and then they also said that and they think they're doing you a favor by telling you that as a fortune teller, like they're validating you. But it would make me so mad. I would say, as a kid, I didn't really hold any punches. I would just say like, so what are you doing here? Why are you just going from one diviner to the next and getting the same answer, being told the same things? Why are you not doing something? Why are you not changing? Why are you not taking the information and maybe trying something new to get out of this situation? So I think one of my first sort of important discovery, the child, just was about human psychology, engaging with clients and realizing that this is a very common pattern. People become almost addicted to divination. They like hearing the same information and not doing anything. So I would actually get quite firm with them. I'd say, I'm not going to read for you again, like before a certain amount of time has gone by. And if you can do whatever you want, but like, I'm not interested in just repeating things and you sort of smiling amiably and, just being kind of entertained. For me, I saw that the value in divination is primarily in giving people a little bit of extra knowledge, like a little bit of extra insight, information, data, which, my emphasis in readings is always about empowering people so that they can almost always when people come to a reader, something's going on and it's troubling them. Something bad has happened. They're afraid something bad is going to happen. They want something good to happen. They don't know what to do. They feel trapped. Like there's some problem. And so my feeling is that it's the responsibility of a diviner not just to read the cards or whatever it may be, but to assess the querent, the client, the patient, and say, you know, and ask that person, what do you need? What information do you need? Which, if you had, would empower you to be able to act and get a bit closer towards your goals or avoiding problems or obstacles. Sometimes people don't know what that is. They don't know what information they need. And so that can be the question to put to the oracle. What do I need to know to accomplish X, Y, or Z? I now insist that at the beginning of the encounter, that clients and I dialogue about what questions they need or want to ask and to what end, because I find that that has a better outcome um, than if you just kind of. I've experimented through the process of the years, over the years. Like, I remember there was a key point about maybe 2 or 3 years into reading where I discovered that there were people who didn't believe that divination was real, that they thought that it was all cold reading or outright fraud. And that shook me as a child because I was like, I'm not a fraud, am I? I didn't even know there were frauds. I didn't even know there was cold reading. So I then spent like a year or two refusing to let clients talk to me about their problems. And they sat down, I would just read the cards, and then only later they could then say like if that was accurate or ask further questions. And that was useful in some ways, but I quickly realized that people didn't need accurate predictions. They needed good advice, and they also needed help to use that advice. And a lot of the time, clients are confused. They don't really know what they want. They need to sit down with somebody that is outside of their situation and talk through what they're afraid of and what they hope for and what they're trying to do. And so I see divination by itself is one whole thing. You know, you either believe or you don't believe that there are strange, random procedures by which we can glean information about hidden forces and patterns and so on. That's one thing. But then it's like, okay, well, what do you do with that? If divination is real, how do you use it for clients in a beneficial way? And so what I've discovered is that clients don't always just need the answer from the oracle. They also need assistance in making use of the answer. And I try to involve them from the beginning, from the first meeting, in a way that empowers them, that gives them agency, you know, to frame the divinatory request, the petition to the oracle, with with a question that kind of that they're proud of, that they're proud to kind of put to the oracle, that they take seriously, that they've thought through, you know, a question that will allow them to get the information which they need, which they can then do something with to accomplish their goals. So I've discovered over time that is just as important as, you know, okay, can I correctly interpret these symbols? Can I, you know, did I correctly have a psychic hit? You know, was I accurate? Because I regularly saw people come back. This is one of the most common things that would happen with clients, is they'd come back and they'd say, "Oh, I didn't understand what you were saying 6 months ago. I thought I did, but then this thing happened, and I suddenly realized it was just as you said. I had a car accident, you know?" And I'm like, well, fuck, I didn't want you to have a car accident or whatever, you know? I didn't want you to have a breakup that you were unprepared for because of X, Y, or Z. I actually didn't want that for you. That's why I told you about it. So again, clients will often come back and say, yeah, you know, like those things did come to pass. I couldn't see it, but they did. And then I would think to myself, well, what's the point of all this? You know, if it's not going to help people have more sort of confidence and agency in their life, which is again tying back into that earlier statement I made about how sometimes divination itself can be the problem. Sometimes the prescription I would give is less divination, no more divination, stop going to diviners. So there's that too. But you asked, what is divination? How exactly does it work? Did I touch on that in in everything I just said?
You did, and you touched on much else also. Let's ground this then with your own, if you want, biographical journey with divination, which began as a child, both as a practitioner and then later as a scholar. And we were chatting before we began the way in which those two categories are different, but they can inform each other. They can even come together in certain cases. So I'm curious about that, your own divinatory journey. Which systems did you explore? Were there any revolutions in understanding or approach that, or crises perhaps of practice that occurred to you as you went through? Any key mentors or influential encounters from a sort of biographical point of view, both as a practitioner, as it was primarily, and where relevant as a scholar?
Yeah, so I think in our very first interview, I touched on some of this personal background. So neither of my parents are spiritual people. They're not like aggressively against religion or spirituality, but they're kind of, I'd say my mom is probably agnostic. My dad is an atheist, was raised in a Jewish family that expected him to be Jewish in a kind of broadly secular way, but really invested in his Jewish identity and sort of social world, and he rebelled against that. And so my sister and I were not raised with any kind of religious belief. Our parents and broader family did not impose any form of a religious belonging or belief or spirituality on us at all. And both my parents gave my sister and I a lot of space to just read and make connections and just pursue any interests that we had. And I had always had this sense, I think I explained it to you before all those years ago. I'd always had this sense from a young age that there were clearly other realities, the world of dream, the world of spirit, that there was clearly just so much more going on than what most people in waking material reality talked about or engaged with. I also knew that just in terms of, adults, when you're a little kid, like adults talk about lots of things. You watch movies and you read fairy tales, and there's lots of discussion of this other world, these other worlds of spirits and deities and magic and divination. Um, like your parents might not be religious, but they'll still extract the wishbone from the chicken and then dry it out and give you and your sister the wish. You know this practice, right? The wishbone, where you put your little pinky on and then your wish is fulfilled. I mean, there's so many examples, heads or tails, um, playing rock, paper, scissors, like all our culture is saturated with histories of esotericism, divination, witchcraft, magic. But my parents weren't interested directly in any of that and didn't sort of encourage me actively. My maternal grandmother was more than passingly interested in consulting with astrologers, mediums. She also she was an unconventional woman who, got married many times and sort of behaved in ways that were not in keeping with like a proper woman of her generation. And I think she kind of internalized that and sort of dressed like a witch. She would sort of let people know that she was maybe a witch. Um, she was born in England, but she wasn't really a practitioner. She had a couple of esoteric books, which I think she had flipped through. But she would sometimes say that she could predict the sex of an unborn baby for friends or family members. And she was interested, and she had a kind of circle of diviners that she would consult with. But I can't remember if it was around my 10th or 11th Christmas. But I don't know, she spoke to my mom, and she saw tendencies in me that I don't think I had fully understood or named. And she said, I think we should I think we should buy him tarot cards. I think we should see what happens. I did not know what tarot cards were. I didn't ask for it. And we should buy him some books too. So these are the cards that I still use to read with clients. It's a little Waite Coleman deck. These were the cards I got when I was 10 or 11. Ever really used them primarily to read with. So they're the oldest belonging that I have. Um, and yeah, I mean, my mom and my grandmother gave me, I think I had gone to bookstores around that time and was starting to look at occult material. And they picked this up. But yeah, they gave me a little book. There was the brief booklet that came with the Rider Company Waite Coleman deck. And then there was also another book that they bought by a professional tarot card reader from, I can't remember if she was British or American, a slim book that was about like beginner's guide to reading tarot, mostly from a Jungian depth psychology perspective, if I recall correctly. And then they also bought me this book called The Hidden World of the Occult, which was this lurid sort of book with these very, intense photos of all kinds of things, psychic surgery, auras, the Loch Ness Monster, Aleister Crowley, one of those just grab bag of things. And I mean, that was it. It was just that it was over after that, you know. When I suddenly realized that there was this system of eliciting hidden information by reading, because I also loved reading in general. I loved language and reading. Um, when I realized that, and then I began reading for my family members, and I also began reading for some of their friends. And I was always a very strange, precocious kid up until you'd be amazed how late it was in my life. I didn't really talk. I know it's hard to believe, but I didn't really talk. I was a very brooding, internal child who was quite scary to adults. I can't remember if I've mentioned this to you before, but my grandmother and parents actually at one point, I don't know how this speaks to their parenting, but at one point they actually thought I managed to successfully convince them that I had taught myself to read English. Um, at around the age of 5 because I had just memorized things they would read to me. There were these monster in my pocket, little collectible plastic monster cards that talked about world mythology in incredibly racist ways. But I was fascinated by them. Again, this kind of occult hidden knowledge across cultural boundaries, and people would read them to me, and I would memorize the information, and then I would say them back. And so I think for me to just teach myself from one or two books how to read tarot wasn't, I think they were already prepared for that, as weird as it was, because I was such an autodidact and so kind of independent. My grandmother also had another book, which honestly, I think she said she bought it at the airport. But this book was just like gold to me. It was one of those books that were published in the 70s, those paperbacks that was just like a collection of stuff from different sources. Like a 3-page explanation on how to scry with a crystal ball, or a 2-page explanation on how to read tea leaves, or a crash course for beginners on the 12 zodiacal signs, and the houses of an astrological chart. By today's standards, really rudimentary stuff that anyone could Google in a second. But this was like precious to me, precious. And it was jam packed with stuff. It even had some of the Solomonic. It had some of the talismans from the Key of Solomon, and uh, the Black Pullet. That French grimoire. And so I was just like, wow, there's clearly a whole world of systems and information across cultures and time. And I was just like, I have to know more about this. With tarot, though, it was very natural. It was very immediate. I didn't really need to study much. It clicked. It happened really fast. The whole process of looking at a tableau of images and then sensing things that, according to the adults I was reading for, were accurate, just worked. And very quickly, I started reading quicker than I would recommend for like my own students, for example. I don't recommend my own trajectory for students that I teach tarot to. Um, Very quickly, I started reading for strangers on real life issues. Um, and how that started was there was this thing in South Africa of our flagship kind of kids after apartheid sort of ended and there was finally a sort of de-strangling of TV media. We had a more kind of democratic kids channel called KTV, Kids TV. And they hosted a thing once a year in different cities in South Africa. I was in Durban at the time. My hometown, and they had this thing called Kids KTV Kids Market Day, where you had to write a business proposal. It was to develop like entrepreneurism amongst children. And so I was already developing this hobby of reading cards. So my mom said, you should go. Well, I don't know whose idea it was actually, if it was hers or mine, or I can't remember. But she said, you should have a stall. You should you should fortune tell for people. So I was like, oh, okay. Like, because I'm 10, I'm like, oh, all right, fine. Like, that's fine. Um, and I mean, we had a bigger setup. You know, we sold herbs, and my mom sews, so she has sewed some like kind of beanies, and then we made these candles that were out of wax crayons, which were like looked nice but didn't work at all. So we kind of made a like an esoteric shop. um, and I just had a trestle table. My mom even made a, I can send you a photo. I mean, I was mortified at the time, but she made a, so as she was invested to a point, clearly. She made a paper hat, a wizard's hat that had, I drew astrological glyphs, and I had a chalkboard and a poster that said, at that time I was offering a lot of like modalities of reading, very basic palmistry, astrology, reading with semi-precious stones and dice, but primarily with tarot. As time went on, I just started only really reading tarot, and also I subsequently learned a thing or two about runes and made a set of runes and read with those. Sometimes in combination with tarot. And yeah, that market day, I saw so many clients, children, adults, teenagers. I was charging a nominal fee. I mean, like cents, like 1 rand or 50. You know, it was like, but I read for a lot of people and they were impressed with the results. Again, I was just doing this. I was just doing this intuitively, you know, and you could say maybe this was bad parenting. You shouldn't have let a child just just do this for strangers. But I just at a certain point people started saying, well, where's your business card? Like, how can I see you again? And I was like, well, I don't, I'm 10, you know. And so then I did another flea market, which was not for children. It was a general holistic outdoor flea market. Very interesting, very windy, very difficult to keep the cards on the table that day by the beachfront. There was also a group of Wiccans who subsequently got naked and went into a tent and did their coven did a ritual to still the wind during the event. So already being in these environments exposed me to many things that I didn't even know existed. I didn't know what Wicca was until I met high priestesses and priests. I mean, I was really just, like I said, an autodidact with no ancient lineage or family tradition. But increasingly, just by being in these spaces, I began to meet many people. So the big kind of shift was I began reading at a flea market that was open every Saturday through the morning and the afternoon. A beautiful open air flea market, craft market near my house that was in a public park. And initially, I had spoke with the woman who ran the market, and she said, "You're so small, like you don't have to pay anything to be here with your little table." You know, I was still charging such small amounts. And I still remember the first time I was at that sort of far fringe of the market. My parents would check in on me. Closest to me was a French Mauritian lady who was selling secondhand fur coats. Why she was doing this in the humid Durban climate, I don't know. But she had other things. And I still remember she was the first client I had kind of in the position as like, I'm a tarot card reader who does this now. And she was her husband. Um, and again, when I think back, I'm like, why were you asking a 10-year-old with no license in marriage counseling this question? But I gulped and I did a divination, and it was resoundingly clear that the husband was a piece of shit and that she probably should divorce him. And she had already essentially decided to do so because of his abusive behavior. And I told her that. And she cried and she said, it's true. And she said, I thank you. And that was the first experience I had probably, I mean, maybe there were others prior, but like it sticks in my mind because that's something most diviners know. They know that 90% of people, they already know what they need to do, or they already know what the situation is. What they need is someone outside of themselves in a spooky way to say, like, geez, girl, what are you doing? Like, or like, or to confirm things that they know, to make them less afraid to say the truth to themselves. Because the thing is, I think most people are much more intuitive, much more capable of accessing what in Tibetan Buddhism we call the inner guru, um, the wise knowing quality of their own consciousness. Um, but sometimes it's hard for many reasons for people to do that. Um, so yeah, and then from there was a table at the flea market of some lovely women, you know, very much the kind of typical profile for this kind of scene, like older ladies who sold crystals and incense, and it was a crystal stand. They sold crystals as having spiritual properties or healing abilities, and I didn't know anything about crystals at that point. I knew visually that they were a part of the New Age world. Visited them very, very shyly. And back then, that was when people were still talking about indigo children. Um, and so a lot of people started saying that I was that. And I remember thinking, what the fuck? Like, you know, I've been told I was a special child from a precocious special child from a very early age because I have spastic cerebral palsy. I had a very traumatic birth. They didn't know if I was going to live. I had, you know, I couldn't really walk unaided in the earliest years of my life. I went to a special needs school. I had lots of physical therapy and surgeries. I was always just different, you know. And then I'm gay, you know. It's like, you know, I'm half Jewish. It's like it really stacks up. But like, I'm also the youngest child, and so I mean, I was quite used to people saying I was special, but I remember them like showing me other indigo children too. And I remember thinking like, I don't feel like I have anything in common with this person. You know, what does this all mean? So that was also another important, I mentioned this to you before. There was another important point for me. Okay, firstly, these lovely ladies at the crystal stand, they said, "You're so like but lonely and vulnerable by yourself on the with the crows like on the far end of the park. Like, come put your table and your sign behind us on the street." Because they sort of face the street and we'll look after you, which I think my parents were happy for. And so that was one of the first mentorship relationships I had. The original woman who ran it was quite old and she kind of retired. I can't remember if she actually died. Um, but then the slightly younger woman who took over from her, her job was she inseminated uh, she was a person who actually inseminated over in an IVF clinic. So she was not somebody who was unfamiliar with mainstream science, which was also a fascinating part of her personality. But she ran this crystal stand, and you know, these women and the clients who came, I just absorbed a lot of information from them. You know, they taught me about their understanding of what crystals did. And it wasn't just that, it was that I saw so many clients who were having so many different experiences, who came from so many different walks of life, different class backgrounds, different, you know, cultures, and had different racial backgrounds or had been racialized and under apartheid in different ways. I met people who are going through spiritual crises, financial crises, personal crises. You know, I heard so much information about failed marriages and relationships. It was a real crash course in human suffering, but also human resilience and also spirituality. Um, so many people that I met were telling me all of this stuff. You know, this one person was like, "Oh, I'm an alien abductee." And I was like, "Oh, that aligns with certain experiences I've had or things I've heard of." Or this person was training to be a shaman in a particular indigenous tradition. This person was a Reiki healer. Um, so I learned a lot just from people, my clients, telling me or me gleaning from their lives what they were involved with or what was happening. The ladies at the crystal stand were also mentors, and then I would go with them periodically to these big, like maybe once every 3 months, like holistic fair warehouse things. And then that was very grueling. I would see client after client after client, sometimes just for hours on end. Um, and again, my parents weren't making me do this, just in case anyone was wondering. They weren't like taking my earnings. My dad would pretend he was doing that as a kind of typical boomer dad type joke. But like literally no one was making me do this. My parents were always like, it's all up to you. If you want to know about this, if you want to meet these people, if you want to do this, like there was no pressure at all. I think they were just happy that because I was such a withdrawn, quiet, brooding kid. And I think they just saw me developing a skill and meeting all these people. And I mean, it was way over their heads. They had no idea how any of this worked, what any of this meant. Like, thankfully, aside from one encounter when I was about 15 with a deeply predatory occultist, um, I I had no bad experiences. All the adults in my life were fiercely protective and uh, yeah, and were really just there. Honestly, it was interesting because they taught me, but they also would come to me for readings, and I read voluminously. So this was an interesting dimension because what I quickly realized was that a lot of these people didn't read voluminously. And that's not necessarily a criticism, but I was always interested, okay, how did these ideas fit together? How do ley lines and ancient aliens and alien abduction and tarot card reading? Because often in modern society, all of this stuff is packaged together. Just like in my childhood, you often can find these books that are like mysteries of the occult, and it's just a jumble of everything. Um, and and I was like, well, how does all this fit together? Does it fit together? Is all of this true? Is none of this true? Like, so a lot. I think I really am grateful that my investment in exploring these things was always grounded in what was my experience and what were other people's experience. What were genuine people who had no reason to lie? What were genuine people experiencing and doing? What frameworks were they using to try to make sense of things? I quickly realized, though, there was a lot of nonsense out there, a lot of historically inaccurate, blatantly false claims, conspiracy theorizing, anti-science kind of pseudoscience. Um, and but I just when it came to tarot, it was always in a sort of intuitive process. And so what happened over time is I just increasingly studied more and more materials about how tarot worked. Um, I didn't really spend much time at the beginning memorizing or studying though, because the process was always quite intuitive to me. As time went on, and I became interested in Wicca and neo-paganism and modern witchcraft. It's a whole other story, but through a client and whose teenage daughter had been helped by this lady, I met a woman, a suburban housewife who became my witch mentor. I still don't know exactly what her background was. She was a high priestess in some neo-pagan tradition, self-appointed, I don't know. But she was a really valuable adult mentor to me. She didn't teach me how to read tarot. I already had a reputation in Durban. She already knew who I was. But I called her up and I said I need guidance because I'm just reading books by myself. And I would see her once a week with she insisted that she meet my mom first, but she basically she prescribed to me reading lists. She gave me some anthropological material on magic to read. She gave me fantasy novels about magic. She said, look, even though this is not real, you can glean something from this because everything a fantasy author imagines about magic is based in some way in human experience. And she also gave me some sort of more new agey books to read, which we read together. She prescribed me a bunch of affirmations to read regularly. She taught me how to see and feel energy and auras. She, yeah, we did a lot of chatting about also my own like issues, difficult family situations, post my parents' divorce, which I think really helped me be a lot more stable and self-aware. A lot of our sessions together was just kind of like therapy. Um, but also with stuff around energy healing and around the power of manifestation and the mind and magic. We never really did much magic together. She um, did some energy work on me. I did some sort of trance journeying under her guidance. But our sort of mentorship was cut quite short when I moved to Cape Town. And subsequent to that, I met a lot of friends, people, I went from an interest in Wicca, but I quickly realized that I wasn't so interested in adopting a religion. I was really interested in understanding the mechanisms of magic and communication with spirits, divination in a more sort of generic, unaffiliated way, like maybe even a more academic, ethnographic way, you could say. And then I discovered Western ritual magic, Golden Dawn, Thelemic magic, and again, mostly practiced alone, relying on internet resources, internet forums. I met one or two people around my age and older who were involved with ritual magic practices, and we talked ideas and shared books. Occasionally, did some spiritual exercises together, but never really full-blown ritual work. So I was really by myself and really talking to a lot of people in forums, chat rooms. I attempted to, I think I mentioned this to you before, I attempted to join Servants of the Inner Light, the Dolores Ashcroft Nowicki was the medium and ritual magician at the head of that group, and Herbie Brennan as well. I had read their books, but they told me at 16 or 15 I was too young to be a probationer, and I had to wait until I was 18 or even older. So I never joined an official lodge or magical tradition or anything like that. And even my practicing of Golden Dawn style magic was very eclectic and experimental. I quickly plugged into chaos magic developments that were happening from the 70s through the 90s. And um, so that added quite an experimental flavor uh, to what I was doing. Years later, I would meet one of your guests, Lionel Snell, Ramsey Dukes, when he moved to, who I couldn't believe was there in South Africa because I had read his work and adored it, his theory of magic. But these were always contacts and friends. I don't feel like anyone ever really taught me magic. Um, in a very one-to-one way. But I had a lot of friends who were psychic, and I did a lot of experimenting around that. This is a whole other thing, but when people who have psychic sensitivities are next to each other, I don't know why, but it can really unlock things. And I've had a lot of interesting experiences simply just in meeting with people and being open to them or meeting other shamans or diviners. And is always a very interesting experience. Um, but yeah, tarot became my mainstay. And as I often say, it was really a passport into, oh, here's the devil. It was really a passport into everything because to make head or tails of what the hell is going on with kind of like the modern tarot, with modern tarot, like 19th century, 20th century iconography requires you to basically educate yourself in so many things because the developers of contemporary tarot, the occultists who created the occult tarot, themselves drew together so many arguably entirely disparate systems and symbols and things and kind of dumped them all onto the cards, onto the existing template of iconography that's there. And so, because anyone who's confronted with this pack of 78 cards, from the beginning, they're going to be like, wow, these are really captivating images. I have no idea what they are supposed to mean. But they'll see things like the devil, and they'll be like, well, I know that from Christianity and culture. And then they'll also be like, well, and here's an angel in temperance. And they'll say, oh, what's that symbol there? Oh, that's an alchemical symbol. That's the alchemical symbol for fire. What's alchemy? And then you'll say, what's temperance? Like, oh, that's a Christian virtue. What's that doing here? Oh, and why is there Hebrew on the breast of this angel? Oh, it's the Tetragrammaton, Yud He Vav He, the unpronounceable name of God. Um, and then this is before you even pick up a book, which might then be spouting jargon from, Victorian occultism or Jungian psychology or you terms from Advaita or like, Tibetan Buddhism or ancient Egyptian, myth. And so automatically any thinking responsive person I feel is going to be like either overwhelmed or they're going to be like, okay, what's all this about? So I just followed all the threads. I followed all of them as much as possible. So in that way, I'm really grateful to Tara. I think I say with total love, it's an incredibly bloated system. It's an unusually bloated divinatory system. I say that because um, usually divinatory symbol sets are very small. Having 78 cards is actually very unwieldy and is part of the reason why tarot is read the way it is read. The tarot has these two halves, the minor arcana and the major arcana, as occultists call it, using this kind of very awe-inspiring sounding Latin terminology, which they invented. It's not sort of a traditional label for the tarot. So originally, these minor arcana, which are the suited cards, there are 56 of them. They really are just one version of the ancient playing card deck that exists in many different forms. And they have the same point of origin as poker cards. It's just that with time, certain versions of the playing card deck became more favored by tarot card readers or more associated with tarot. So, what we could strictly speaking call the actual tarot is the Maya Arcana or the trumps, the 22 titled cards, numbered and titled cards, which have these kind of striking images, the devil, the emperor, the fool, um, and putting these two kinds of secrets, the greater and lesser secrets together, resulted in a deck that has 78 cards, which, as I was saying, is quite bloated. And tarot is not only kind of unwieldy because of its size, but it's also layered with so many different influences. And I think that that's something which a beginner is immediately going to be confronted with, for better and for worse. In fact, the whole way in which tarot, modern tarot, is read is very different to how other forms of cartomancy, reading with playing cards, which frequently use smaller packs and typically lay out all the symbols, all the individual cards on the table in order to do a reading. Tarot is unusual in that it's a form of cartomancy where it's not feasible anymore because of these historical developments to actually place 78 cards out just for practical reasons for each reading. Usually in divination, when you do a reading, sort of all the cards are on the table in a sense, not literally and figuratively. Every one of the possible symbol pieces can appear in the reading. Now, what is done with tarot is basically you just shuffle and cut and then select a predetermined number that you lay out into a spread. Spreads are a very recent innovation. Spread being a predetermined layout where you say, okay, this is what this card means. This is what that card means. Very often the logic, the syntax of a reading in other divinatory systems comes from the layout of the objects themselves, of the symbol set itself. Usually you have an element in the symbol set that represents the querent or the client. So you can see how close or far away cards or objects or bones are to that client. And internally, there's a sort of spatial symbolic logic, just like in astrology too. You know that house one represents the kind of public face or ego of the querent. You know that house 12, right before it, is what is behind it, what is unseen, what is hidden. So tarot is strange and a bit awkward in that it now involves people. Some readers use a significator card, a predetermined card, a court card that represents the client, and then they lay the cards out around that. But the development of spreads, of predetermined arrangements with only a few cards, that has given tarot a unique flavor. It also is a divinatory system where like one card can only ever appear once in one spread. Whereas in other systems like astrology or geomancy, the same planet or the same geomantic sign can appear in more than one location. So different divinatory systems have different features and rules. And I have always said that tarot is very, for better and for worse, tarot is very overloaded. It's burdened with a lot of layers of symbolism and very disparate threads of, it's alchemy, astrology, non-Jewish Hermetic Kabbalah. It's, Victorian occultist understanding of ancient Egyptian religions and Tibetan religions and yoga. It's the earlier Christian infused iconography, which historians of tarot continue to argue about, like how did these images develop? It's all of the invented histories and claims that tarot promoters have made, saying that these images represent ancient Greco-Egyptian Hermetic truths. Or Jung loading his own system onto tarot, saying that they are archetypes in the Jungian understanding and should be engaged with as such. All of that is there. When I teach people to read tarot, though, I actually discourage them from learning any of that. I basically, what I say is, look, because there's a way in which people learn tarot. It's the classic way people learn tarot, and it's also the classic reason people don't learn how to read tarot. Is that somebody gives you a deck of cards, or you buy a deck, and just like PSA, there is this strange piece of superstition, which you may have heard, which says that you cannot purchase a tarot deck for yourself and use it successfully. That is garbage. I don't know where that idea has come from. There isn't an ancient tradition of tarot divination, period. So I don't know where this piece of law could have come from. I mean, depends on your definition of ancient. The Maya Arcana date from like the 15th century, give or take, the imagery. But divinatory tarot dates from the late 1700s. So what that means is that tarot as a fortune-telling divinatory tool has a very recent history relative to the history of the imagery of the cards themselves. So that already tells you something. But people often say, oh, no, you can't read tarot unless someone gives you a deck. That is nonsense to me, because what so often happens is that somebody gives you a deck that you hate, that you don't like the artwork, or you have no relationship to, or you don't want a tarot deck. So, so why are you going to read under those circumstances? And then a lot of people, I've actually met people who are waiting for someone to spontaneously give them a tarot deck so that they will give themselves permission to learn how to read these cards. And I think that's deeply unfortunate. So hopefully, if anyone's listening and they were under that misapprehension, look, I mean, if you want to use that as a principle on which to, it's quite beautiful idea. I was given these cards by my, beloved grandmother. Um, I'm sure she'd heard that idea too, actually. I seem to recall that she had. So it's wonderful. I mean, if you want to, but there's nothing really traditional about it. I mean, if you want to look back in um, the grimoires more often say that you should purchase magical. If you're not forging magical tools by hand, you should purchase them without quibbling over the price. It doesn't say wait till someone gives you this obscure occult tool. That doesn't make any sense. So what usually happens is someone gets given or buys a tarot deck. Then they buy a book. Maybe the booklet comes with the particular deck, or they buy a more substantial book. And typically, books are like dictionaries. They're, so again, this language analogy. It's like getting a grammar textbook and believing that if you just memorize that grammar textbook, you are going to know how to understand and speak a foreign language. It's not true. Anyone who's learned a language will tell you that. There's benefit in reading the grammar textbook. But what usually happens is that people then are faced with the daunting prospect of having to memorize sometimes quite elaborate meanings for each of the 78 cards. Now, my argument is you don't have to do that at all to quickly learn how to divine with tarot cards. Now, there's benefit to studying the history of tarot and how ideas about the divinatory meaning of each card changed over time. We have at least, like I said, a history going back to like 1788 or so, where we have the first kind of records of books that explain what the trumps, the Maya Arcana mean, and so on. We have other traditions of cartomancy using the playing card decks too that can be drawn on. And then we have this big revolution from the Victorian period where there's kind of a lot of discussion about occult tarot and how tarot actually is a key, a pictorial key, as Arthur Edward Wade said, to understanding the mysteries of Kabbalah. Um, the revolutionary moment was when the 22 trump cards became associated by occultists of the Hebrew alphabet, which already had a connection with the 22 paths of the tree of life, especially as conceived by Christian, non-Jewish, esoteric appropriators of Jewish Kabbalah. So you already have centuries of history of kind of even the occult claims and the occult symbolism, the overlaying of Victorian esotericism onto tarot iconography is already part of a legacy, a pre-existing legacy of cultural appropriation and radical reinterpretation of Jewish mysticism by non-Jews, put towards ends that rabbis would never recognize or promote. So you've got to know that this is what you're stepping into when you approach tarot. But you don't have to immerse yourself in that to learn divination. So what I tell clients is you have to read what's there. You have to divine based on the principle that the cards are actually another version of the situation facing your client or you. It is the situation just in pictures. And every individual spread will require you to find the internal logic and language, the pictorial, iconographical language, the resonances and that make sense in relation to the client and their question. So anyone can pick up a tarot deck and learn how to read it completely blind, completely naively, what, of course, there's things that they need to know in advance, which is what I teach students. They need to understand basic parameters of tarot imagery. They need to know that there are four suits associated inconsistently, depending on which occultist you talk to, with the elements, with the kind of Indian, Greek elements of fire. The four elements, not including space, fire, water, earth, air. Um, they need to know that there's court cards. They need to know that the cards are numbered from an ace to a 10. The court cards include a king, a queen, a knight, and depends on the deck. Some decks will say princesses, some will say pages, some will say knaves. They need to know about these parameters. They need to know there's 22 trumps. They need to know they have names. But beyond that, once the basic grammar and syntax, I get students reading experience that some people will argue with me about this, but I can get a lot. Some tarot card readers are really angry. They say, if you're not putting down at least 10 cards, you're not a real tarot card reader. And my feeling is like, if you can't answer a complex inquiry with 3 cards, you're probably a bad tarot card reader. But everybody is different. So I believe that 3 cards is the minimum for me. It's the minimum density of iconographic density required to elicit sufficient information. So what I get my students to do is I say to them, if they try to read for themselves, they either have the problem that like, well, I have nothing, there's nothing going on in my life. I don't, and I don't want them personally as the teacher to read on serious emotionally charged issues because they're trying to learn. They're trying to play the game of tarot. So they need to relax. So I get them to imagine imaginary clients, which in itself is a very good training exercise because they're using their imagination. I say to them, tell me what your boudoir, what your tarot card reader boudoir would look like. What's your ideal? You are a brilliant diviner. Tell me what you're wearing. Tell me where you are. You're already top of your game, in your element. What does it look like? Then somebody comes into your tent or knocks on your door or whatever, and they have a question. And so I ask them, who's this person who comes in? What do they look like? What's their name? And already if the student can't answer those questions, that already tells you that they're going to struggle with reading tarot because they can't allow impressions to intuitively flow. They can't trust their own imagination, which is not invention. It's an organ that we possess as human beings that is profound and powerful. So I get them to then come up with a querent, a client. And then I also get to coach them, and because a very important part of divination, in my opinion, is knowing how to ask a question well to get the kind of information you need. There's a way to ask questions that's bad. The tarot can only answer in terms of the question that you ask. So if you go, what should I do? That's a terrible question. Because why are you asking a bunch of pieces of paper, what you should do? That's dumb. That's childish. Don't ask pieces of paper what you should do. What do you want? What's going on? What are you afraid of? What information do you need? Craft your question, reverse engineer it so that the cards can speak to you, so that they can show you the information that you don't have. Let them make it easy for them to do that. So 3 cards. And then of course there's a grammar to the 3 cards, placed left to right. You can read them in a sequence as moving from past to future, or kind of a past present. You can read them as sort of synthesis, antithesis, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. I have a particular way that I understand those 3, an emphasis I place on them, which students can adopt or not, but I found useful. Then, of course, the big question technically for readers is, do you use reversals? So reversals being that you allow the cards to appear upside down in an arrangement or not. Some readers don't use reversals, most do. It's a science of its own. Um, Reversals, I think, are really valuable because they have an iconographic potency. Because as soon as a card with a figure in it is upside down, if that figure is normally facing one direction, it's now facing another. That immediately creates that kind of iconographic density that I'm referring to. So, you know, I try to show the student how to situate themselves. Like you've got to enter into the reading with an understanding that the cards are showing you exactly what is happening and that they are trying to tell you in the terms they have available about that. So I think the time is I didn't always know consciously how I was intuiting certain things from the imagery, but over time I kind of reverse engineered that internal process. So when I teach students tarot, I say to them, okay, who is this figure? Is it the querent? How do you know? And then they have to say, well, and I mean, it seems like a bit of a ridiculous question initially. If you're someone who's like, I'm just staring at pieces of paper, what do you mean, how do I know? I'm like, tell me, how do you know? Like, and then they have to say, well, I see their posture. It's the same as what they look like now. Um, or they say it's a man, or they say I know it's them because in the next five cards, well, if we're using three, they appear in a different but recognizable form. So what you're doing is you're teaching people to see patterns. You're teaching people to read, and those patterns are in a way spontaneous, but deeply layered and complex. Because this is why I'm like, guys, how can you say three cards is not enough? Because if you read in this fashion, you're not only reading the internal conversation or iconographical threads that the tableau in front of you is showing, but you're reading it in relation to the situation and question of the client, to the client and their own reality, you know, how they're dressed that day, the vibe they're giving off. And you're also reading it in relation to what it elicits in you as the diviner. You might look at a card and suddenly feel something in your body. You might that what's that red hat mean? And suddenly get a flash or an impression. You know, and when you've been reading for a long time, you also develop your own relationship with the cards. So you know that like typically when a certain combination of cards appears, that's your typical indication of like a divorce or a litigation or something. You develop this over time. But the thing is, and you know the parameters of the cards. You know which cards are bad. Like one of the most like sort of enjoyable, horrifying things that a tarot card reader can do is just go on TikTok today. Because there's so many people who do these like TikTok lives or Instagram lives where they're aggressively shuffling their decks, like so aggressively shuffling their decks, and then they're just people are asking questions, and then they're just pulling up one card, potentiously showing it to the screen, and then saying, "Yes, no, you're pregnant, you're gonna die," and it's like what's so funny about this is almost 90% of the time, in terms of sort of general tarot principles, there's no correspondence between like they'll take a card that would typically show that someone is like chronically infertile, and they'll be like, "You're having a baby tomorrow," you know. So there are limits. There are limits to we can't take a card which for a certain period of time we can't take a card that represents a mother and say it represents a barren man. You know, it just doesn't make sense. We can't take a card which is associated with like communality and say it's about loneliness. We can't do that. However, in the internal context of the reading, um, cards can come to mean anything situationally within limits. So that's my point. But yeah, I mean, interpret things at many levels. And what I have realized over time too, which is quite fascinating for me to sort of observe in myself as a like learning a language, but there are multiple channels of communication that are happening. It's a little tricky to put into words, but when I sit down with a client and then we've crafted a good question, and then I draw the cards. On the one band, I am seeing the cards answer their question. I see and I hear what the cards are saying in answer to their question. Sometimes, though, the cards also speak to me in addition to that and tell me things about the client which are not directly in answer to their question, but are relevant. So, and I don't always tell that information to the client. So that I might think that the answer to the question is no, absolutely not. You're never going to hear from this person again. But usually there's more detail than that. But let's say that's the answer. But then that's what I'd say to me simultaneously, because the client's an asshole. The client is lying about their culpability in this situation. For example, the client is an alcoholic. The client is sadder about the situation than they're telling you. So you can decide as the reader whether you reveal that layer of information to the client. Sometimes it's important not to reveal it to them. Often revealing it to them will create a better connection, will make them realize, I don't know, be more honest. Also, there's a third level, and this happens sporadically. But sometimes I have an analogy that I use for this feeling. You know what? You know when you take a spigot and you put it in like a maple tree, and then you tap the tree and you get out syrup? That's the best analogy I have for how it feels when I read. I feel like some cards are loaded with syrup and some cards are light with syrup. I don't even really need to read them. They're more like giving some mutual support. And it just feels like there's a seam, to use another metaphor, like a mining metaphor. There's a lot to mine or extract in a particular card. And sometimes you start extracting and you just feel like, wow, you can feel when the card is empty, when you've tapped it sufficiently. But then sometimes something else will happen. I always give offerings for the client's supportive spiritual forces, guides, ancestors, as you like. I give them offerings and say if they need a moment to speak, now they can do that. I'm not a medium per se, but occasionally something will happen where I've read the what the card is saying about the query, but then the card will suddenly become a window or a doorway, usually for a deceased immediate relative, a father, an uncle, an aunt. And then I don't know how to explain it, but I just feel that that person, often who's involved in the reading, but not always, is present. And then sometimes that card elicits mediumistic information. And often that's very emotional too, because suddenly I feel that dead father or cousin or whatever, who then says something which I would never get out of the card's internal iconographic conversation. Does that make sense? And then often people are like, like, and I'm like, your guess is as good as mine. Like, I just go with it when that happens. So I think if you talk to tarot card readers, I think most of them will tell you that there are those different bands of information. And yeah, and I think a big problem that people have, to go back to what I was saying, is that when they learn tarot, they've got the book and then they're like, fuck, I have to memorize the meanings. And you will see it all the time. I'm learning this big Bible it's about the Lenormand deck. It's not a tarot card reading system. It's very popular in Brazil, and I'm teaching myself divinatory Portuguese while also because learning these cards. I've had the Lenormand cards for a while, so I am doing what everybody does. I'm reading the book, you know. And with Lenormand, you do actually have to the style of reading, the way the cards are laid out. It's much less impressionistic. It's much less internal to the arrangement of cards themselves. But you know, you will often see people learning tarot with their friends, and they'll be there with the book, and they'll go, "Okay, it says that this card means this. It says this card means this. So it means that that's happening." And and they're usually not really, it's not accurate because they're missing the point. These cards that have fallen in this position here now in relation to this petition, this question, are telling you the answer. Like, and I think what people do is they go, oh, this is the card that represents sadness, divorce. And sometimes that works. Sometimes it works. But there's a problem when you start thinking about the cards as if they represent things. People will sometimes, but you can tell when someone's a beginner tarot card reader because they'll go, it's the Nine of Cups. It's the card that represents like gratification of your wishes. Sometimes I do that. Sometimes I say that because it makes people feel nice and it's accurate. But if you're just reading the cards as if they are symbols, you're failing to understand. It's like saying, oh, it's the word duck. It goes da a k. No, it's a duck. What does a duck mean? Why is there a duck in the room? You know, like it's these, you should think of these cards as if they are living forces that are actually the situation. Also, if you do that, if you relate to the cards in that way, much more is possible. Much more is also possible in a magical sense. Because if you see the Queen of Coins as the actual woman cheating on your partner, with your partner, you now have a magical link to that woman, which you might have otherwise needed to get her fingernails or her hair. But you know, now if you understand that in tarot terms, in the microcosm of the tarot universe, this is the adulteress. Now you have a card which you can get a tarot deck and you can do sorcery on that card because that is her. Um, on this level that we're dealing. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of like, I don't think I'm alone in this way of understanding the cards. I think it's also common to a lot of divinatory systems, like when Sangomas throw shells and bones and so on. They say this is the bone of the great grandmother. This is the shell of the great grandmother, and her mouth is closed. Her mouth is down. She can't speak. She's literally speaking through this bone, or this shell. The shell is her. Um, so that's something we didn't mention earlier. This kind of another feature of divination more broadly is this. What you're doing is you're creating a third space, a kind of actionable, a miniaturized microcosmic zone in which all of this can be contained and glimpsed even for a moment and maybe, you know, interpreted and dealt with. So that's another, that inside outside microcosm macrocosm quality of divination is also key. And you know, like I had to believe when I was doing that reading with my ex for our mutual friend that those things on that table were the sum total of the forces and conditions shaping my friend's life, the things in that garden. And in that moment, they were. In that moment, they were. Because they needed to be. This is another thing. Like, if mind is non-local, then everything is everywhere at once. Um, it can be if you need it to be. You know, I don't know if you read the translation I did a few months ago of Jimmy Rinpoche's butter lamp divination instructions. It's very simple. You say prayers, invoke the Buddhas, earnestly petition clarity and truth, and then it's a beautiful interdependent support, using a lamp, illumination, a temporary illumination as a prop for temporary illumination. So you light the butter lamp, and then however it burns, you can analyze the wick, you can analyze the sputtering sounds of the flame, you can analyze you can toss grains into the lamp and see where they land and how they burn. And so there's a lot of parameters to use. But he says something that really jumped out at me. More than once, he says, don't be an idiot. Make sure you use a butter lamp that's made with a clean, straight wick, because if you don't, it will burn badly, and then all your omens will just be bad. So he says, like, don't, it's like some people get a tarot. I've seen this happen. Some people get a tarot deck, and a new tarot deck, and then they start reading with it, but they haven't shuffled it, and it's in order. So, they're like, oh, wow, I keep getting all the cards like 1, 2, 3. I'm just like, you didn't shuffle it. But, so G. Mipam says, make sure that the materials you use, the oil you use, everything you use is like right, because you need a clean read. Because you don't want like the fact that there's bugs in your oil to be creating the condition for a bad reading. But then he says something that's really key. He says, but if you've done everything to the best of your abilities, if you've created the ritual space, if you said the prayers, and then, the wick is still crooked or there's a bug in the oil, then you must read that as a doorway into truth, as divination. You have to. You don't have a choice. Because what you do when you divine is you create this heightened space and time, this intensified concentration, this confidence and belief that the answer is present in the signs that are before you, and so you have to act accordingly. That's something that people miss. They say, "Oh, this is the symbol of that." That's already keeping the reading, the divinatory procedure at a remove. It's already a second order interpretation saying this is the card that represents that. I'm like, no, this is your client, this is what's happening. So I hope that makes sense. This is just what I've sort of learned over time. Seems to be a better result. I'm not saying that doing this is the card that symbolizes that, and maybe you'll relate to this archetype in this way. Does that make sense to you? That also works. Sometimes I read at that level too. I say, oh, like maybe you need to like lean into this. So you also need to know how to speak to clients. Some clients really want you to talk to them like a psychologist. Others really want to be in the reading. They really want to read the cards and with you. And that can be good or bad. There's moments, I usually allow moments of that. And of course, there's always question and answer. There's so much fear of like cold reading sometimes, but it's only natural that this is why shouldn't it be a collaborative meaning-making exercise? Clients and readers together, because often the cards can tell me what they're saying. They're saying, like I've had situations, many funny situations like this, where my own assumptions get in the way of the cards. Like, I remember I was reading for a client in her 60s, and I was just so embarrassed by this, but she was asking me about whether this relationship she had started with a man would like pan out to become something more serious. And because I am a judgmental, closed-minded person, I was like, oh, well, this woman in her 60s, she's probably, really hoping for a long-term relationship, because, it can be really lonely when you're older. And I was projecting all this stuff, and I was also cushioning what I was telling her, because the cards are like, oh, no, this is not going to work out at all. And it's not really about that. It's just there's only a sexual connection, and there's no basis for a long-term relationship. And I was pussyfooting around this whole issue because I didn't want to hurt her feelings. But then I found out that she was part of this polyamorous BDSM sex group. And she was like, "Oh, thank God! I have no interest in having a long-term relationship with him, but the dick is great." Like, and I was like, "Wow, I really allowed my own assumptions to get in the way of," and that happens all the time, even after almost 30 years of reading. Like, one gets in one's own way with assumptions and projections all the time. That's why there's value in basing reading on what's there and what the cards elicit in you, rather than like what you think about that. I mean, it's a very delicate tightrope, because sometimes a card will trigger something in me that does need to be digested or translated. So the cards can only really, it's complicated. It's what I was saying before about the medium with the spirit and the watch. Sometimes I'll look at the cards and it will make me think of as suddenly I'll hear a song in my head. And I'm like, is this just an earworm that I should ignore? Well, like Jimmy Pam said, I should probably not ignore it. So then you take a gamble. And sometimes this song is something really relevant to the person because of the words. Or someone will say, oh, that's like a hymn that my dead mother used to sing all the time. And you're talking about the dead mother. So you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And they're asking you, how do I connect with her after she died? And so you're like, oh, you should probably sing that hymn while making some offerings to her. But then other times it's like you will have an image in your head, which is kind of like your image, that you then have to translate it. It's tricky with these mediumistic impressions. Sometimes you see something that's unfamiliar to you, that's familiar to the querent. Sometimes you're seeing your version of the thing that the querent needs to know about. So you see your dad's old car from childhood, but they didn't have a car like that. But you need to talk to them about their dad's old car. You know what I mean? So to a certain extent, you have to work with yourself as the medium for the reading. So there isn't always consistency. That's where it's difficult to know for sure. It's easy to get the kind of level of interpretation wrong. But if you stick with what's right there in the cards, that it helps. As soon as you're already making second and third and fourth order interpretations, I think then the hyperconceptuality of that can be a problem. So even though I do, because I am a very hyperconceptual person, and sometimes some of that has value, but it's very much a passing process. Anyway, that's a glimpse into kind of how I think it helps to relate to the imagery of the cards. If you want to study tarot, the history of tarot iconography, that's a really worthwhile endeavor. And the Victorian occultists, they used tarot as a kind of synthesis of all of these different systems that they themselves had forged into an initiatory system, a self-transformative system for mystical development. So I actually had a point in my tarot reading career where I was increasingly doing things like Kabbalistic path workings and working with the cards as doorways into realms of the soul, and I actually found I became quite a bad, boring reader. I sort of I realized most of my clients just want to know simple things like, is it safe for me to drive my car, 600 kilometers on this holiday trip? Do I need to go to the mechanic? Why do they need to know about the inner child or about the relationship between the world of Olam Ha'atzilut and Olam Ha'briya, in Hermetic Kabbalah? Like, that has no relevance. But then I found that I was often going on these mystical tangents for these clients, and I actually had to stop myself. I had a little like pep talk with myself, and I was like, what's your job? Are you coaching these people in spirituality, or are you giving them clear answers in relation to their problems that will help them? So now I find it's a mixture of both. Um, if you want to learn, like I have a friend right now here in Portugal who's trying to learn tarot symbolism and is constantly coming up against this dense Victorian occultist stuff about Hermetic Kabbalah and all of these intricate associations being made between their understanding of the Hebrew letter and their understanding of the path of the tree of life and how it relates to Thelemic cosmology and all this stuff. But then you look at another occultist and they have a completely different scheme. You know, like the Sefer HaYetzirah, the the ancient Jewish mystical text that is the sort of source of this notion that God created everything out of the permutation of the 22 letters, and each of those letters is connected to planets and elements and things. Like the Sefer Yetzirah system is not the same as the Golden Dawn system. They're the symbol of the tree of life and the paths is not the same. Um, in Lurianic Kabbalah. So, yeah, I mean, it's maddening because you're like, wow, I have to learn all these intricacies and understand how Crowley or whoever is jumping from Sanskrit concept of the yoni to this to crossing the abyss and then astrology and alchemy. But then turns out that like not even the other occultists or Thelemites agree on his this intricate system of correspondences. So it's very valuable if you learn and internalize a symbol set like this. It can structure. I mean, the Golden Dawn actually used their authorized correspondences as a way to test and travel through astral realms, you know, as a way of if if their visions, scrying in the spirit vision, could conform with these kind of this universal set of correspondences, then that was a way of kind of testing its universality, its objectivity in a way, as subjective as it was. But then you don't need to learn all that to be a good diviner. You really, really don't. I mean, it's an open question whether internalizing all of that will actually become a block or prove useful. I think both can be true. But when I teach students, I tell them you don't have to memorize anything. You don't have to, you need to know some basic parameters, but you don't have to memorize anything. You don't have to know what some French guy in the 18th century or 19th century thought about the Knights Templar. Like, you don't need to know any of that. Um, because you could, in theory, just as easily apply these principles I'm trying to teach you to reading some semen on a mirror from a circle jerk, or you know, the rain on your window, or whatever you like. Um, yeah.
While we're on tarot, while we've gone into that, let's keep going a bit. You've talked about different reasons people engage with the tarot. For example, one person may wish to engage with learning the tarot I'm talking about here because they want to know what's happening in the future, like you've said, or they want to better understand the present or the past, or they want to be able to perhaps help others. They feel they have an intuitive urge to help, and they want a vehicle for that. You've also talked about using tarot actually for sorcery, and you sort of only you touched on that. But that's a potent use, I think, of tarot also, is to use it in a sort of working, not merely as a diagnostic tool, but perhaps even as part of a working, magical working of some type, ritual, you know. And you've also talked about,
Yeah.
pardon?
I have done that in the past. Yeah,
Yeah,
it can be very powerful.
indeed. And you're now talking about tarot as a portal to understanding the symbols and systems and doctrines, maps of Western occultism per se. And also, tarot could be, in a way, a portal to a sort of intellectual or academic leaning. You might decide to approach the tarot in that sense, looking at it historically.
History and exchanges between the Islamic world and Europe and
Right.
medieval folk culture and folk religion, like so many strands are present in tarot.
And not to mention the cast of characters involved in tarot. And who are they? And how do they fit into the development of occultism or mysticism or whatever the case may be, and you'll have to get to know those two, sort of a sort of more academic, intellectual bent.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a whole range, and you can emphasize your study in different ways depending on what it is you actually want to get out of the thing.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I wonder then, are there any bad reasons to engage with tarot? I think all of the things we've said up there previously, perhaps we could say those are all kind of standard reasons to engage with tarot. Are there, in your opinion, any other reasons that are good? But are there any bad reasons to engage with tarot? Are there any misapplications of tarot or any dead ends?
For me personally, I'm not very precious or proprietary about tarot. Tarot card user and or diviner has to ultimately find their own way into it. Like a very superficial thing. I don't really personally uh, like modern decks. I don't really like this move to create sort of ultra inclusive decks. Uh, I mean, look, I absolutely applaud and support creating decks which, aren't filled with white people. If you're not a white person, of course you want a deck that, reflects you. But what I'm talking about more is this idea that like we have to make tarot and its symbols inclusive. It doesn't really make sense to me because it's like saying, oh, we only have 26 letters is that right? 26 letters in the English alphabet. That is right, right? Well, I'm not sure if that's technically true, but let's say we have 26 letters. And then we need more because there's other sounds out there, you know? It's like, it doesn't really make sense in terms of what I've been trying to explain about how you relate to a divinatory symbol set. I'm absolutely like one thing that is still a work in development for me. I haven't really done much with it. There's a movement, especially coming out of the US, kind of inspired by um, South African, actually Southern African Sangoma style of divination, of just collecting. Because in South Africa, Izangoma have usually like a base set of like animal bones and shells, which are sort of like common to shamans, and represent some very basic essential ingredients like the client's ancestors that need to speak in certain ways. But every set of symbols for a diviner is different. So the spirits will usually indicate like, and if you compare like a bag of tricks that one diviner has to another, they'll have very idiosyncratic like objects. And so there's this movement now to create your own sort of bone charm reading sets. You just find your own curios, and it's quite freeing for people who are used to other systems that are more rigid because they're like, I literally am just reading using objects that are personal to me. So people will be like, oh, this little bead comes from a broken, bracelet from my grandmother. And so for me, when this bead, throw the curios on the mat or what have you, when this bead appears here, maybe for you it will represent grandmothers, or it will represent estranged relationships because you had an estranged relationship with your grandmother. It could be anything. So I appreciate this move because I think it's teaching people about the underlying mechanisms. Um, I I get kind of annoyed when people get a bit proprietary about tarot, when they say, "Oh, this is what the card means," and that's a wrong interpretation. I know earlier I said you need to be able to say for yourself, "This is a bad card." I see this a lot in New Age divination. Nobody wants to say something is bad. Like nobody, I mean, in every traditional divinatory system, there have to be signs and omens and that are just really fucking awful because really bad stuff happens all the time. If someone says to you, is this going to work out? You can't tell them yes when the answer is no. Like, and you need to be clear on what that answer is. But I think what the bad use of the tarot is a non-creative use, a stultifying use of the tarot. Inherently, it has triggered imaginative, creative, uh, elaborations. There was a game in Europe where people would just take the tarot trumps, which, mind you, were originally used for like a bridge type card game, and they took them and they just because they were kind of vaguely recognizable, this slightly mysterious, vaguely recognizable cultural symbols of Christian concepts and European histories, and they would take them and they would just like hold the card up and they would have to make a poem based on the imagery, you know. So there's a part of me that sometimes gets a bit snobbish when my not necessarily witch but witchy friends will be like, "Let's read for each other. Let's do readings," and I'm like, I'm sitting there and I'm like, they're reading from the book, or they're just not doing a very good job, or I don't know, or they're giving terrible advice in the name of reading what's there. Then I go like, but I can't gatekeep. I don't feel like I can gatekeep around these sorts of things. Like some people have said to me, um, "You're a Buddhist. Why are you not doing Tibetan Mo? Why are you using tarot? You practice Tibetan Buddhism." And I find that so ridiculous because I'm like, I do guru yoga before I do readings. I like, I say mantras. Like what determines whether this oracle is Buddhist or not? Sure, it's iconography as a history, a cultural context, but I've done readings for Tibetans. I've read for many Tibetans. And I have to find a way to talk about Tibetan and Tibetan Buddhist realities through the iconography that exists in these cards. And if I fail to do that, it's not the card's problem, it's my problem. So, um, yeah, like I think when people get too high on their own supply a little bit, that's probably the worst use that I can think of for the cards. But it all depends on what you're saying. Like there's these different avenues and these different investments. So like the Golden Dawn was very interesting because they would say, the cards are actually not just for rank divination. They're not, they shouldn't be cheapened. They contain ancient occult, they're for, spiritual development. But they also taught how to read on very day-to-day questions, and they were drawing on a divinatory traditions, cartomantic traditions. So there's a kind of a slight tension there. It's the same with magic in that context. People will say all magic, like Crowley famously said, all magic which wasn't about, you know, knowledge of one's divine nature was black magic. But any magic that was, but he did a lot of black magic himself, but by that definition. Um, so yeah, I think it depends what you're wanting to do. Like I'm not, the tarot is already so popular that, and no one person can tell another person how to read or the only correct interpretation in a divinatory sense, as far as I'm concerned, is one that elicits accurate, useful information about the client situation. How you get there, I'm not too bothered about. Um, you know, occultists fought and disowned each other. Crowley disowned his former protege because he came up with a different arrangement of the tarot trumps onto the powers of the tree of life, different set of correspondences, and Crowley could not abide this. I mean, there were other things going on there, but um, it was a big point of contention for many years amongst European occultists, like what is the rectified tarot? What's the correct order of the Maya Arcana, and how do they properly relate to the letters of the Hebrew alphabet? People got very vitriolic over arguing about this. But then now that I'm a little bit further away from Western occultism, like even when my friend yesterday or the day before was saying to me, what the hell are these people talking about? So reading sort of some of Thelemic interpretations of cards and wasn't familiar with the Kabbalistic terms, but it also just reminded me how intricate these edifices, House of Cards, even, that occultists have built, but none of them agree with each other. Like, And then in a way, that's sort of part of what Western occultism is, to create your own, it's often said by modern occultists that you haven't truly mastered the tarot until you make your own deck by hand, because you're supposed to have done magic and used spiritual techniques to kind of connect with the universal forces that these cards represent, and then re-language them in terms that are native to your soul. It's a lovely idea. But yeah, I mean, not everybody agrees. There's so much diversity in terms of how all these symbols are overlaid on top of each other and made to relate to each other. And if you're looking for consistency and agreement in the occult community, like, you're probably not going to find it very easily. You have to just kind of get used to that tendency to elaborate creatively. And there's almost an encouragement to create your own currents. And we spoke about this before. Uh, so yeah, a bad use of tarot. I mean, I'm not going to be moralizing about it either. If someone wants to use tarot for sorcery to harm other people, I can't stop them. Um, uh, yeah, I think probably gatekeeping and like authoritative pontificating, um, you know, it that could be the worst thing I could think of, maybe.
I asked you before about any crises that you encountered. Some people I think who are skeptical of tarot, and the same applies to mediums and other sort of for pay
Mm.
diviners of various type. Some people will say, well, this is a sort of exploitative practice. Maybe at best, it's a person with a good heart, with a good intuition, and maybe some good people skills and good, almost counseling skills in a sense. And so
Mm.
it may not be harmful. It could be a sort of, I mean, if you're not going to get qualified as a counselor and practice as a counselor, maybe I suppose you could be a flukily good tarot reader,
Mm.
counselor via that means. But a lot of people say it's exploitative. You're
Mm.
taking money from people and you're diverting them from more fruitful avenues of inquiry. If they're going to address their problems, they have interpersonal problems in their relationship, perhaps they would go to a relationship counselor or talk to their friends or family members or people they know who have good relationships or something like that. They should, rather than going to a diviner, or if they're not sure what they should do next, perhaps they should seek advice from a spread of friends, family, people who know about the area, etc. Going to a tarot reader can dilute energy better spent, perhaps funds better spent in addressing their problem. Another criticism of tarot that I've sometimes heard is that you're giving somebody a chance here to speak into your life. And you can think of that on a magical level, but you can also think of it on a purely psychological level. When somebody starts to put ideas and language, if you open yourself up, problems you're having, questions you have, as people start to put ideas, from just sort of looking at some cards and so on into your life, you're giving them a chance to lay little seeds, little psychological nudges, linguistic nudges in this way and that. Do you really want to open yourself to that sort of an imprint from somebody you may not know? These sorts of concerns don't only come from those who see all such practices as a sort of cold reading pseudo-therapy, basically, pseudo-counselling. So some people see all of that as that. Some, Darren Brown, someone like that, James Randi, etc., perhaps would go along those routes. But also occultists themselves do warn about divination and do warn about engaging in divination practices with certain people and for certain purposes. You've got to watch out what you're doing and so on. You're no doubt aware of all these sorts of criticisms. Have you ever had any crises yourself? You talked about the cold reading crisis when you were younger, about these things. Have you ever considered them? Or do you have any thoughts on these sorts of criticisms?
Oh, yeah. So yes and yes. I mean, I think about them all the time. And I have many thoughts about it. Because I started so young, the older I get, the more the responsibility of divining for another person weighs on me. Um, it's not something these days that I do regularly or enter into. Well, there's periods where I do it regularly, but that I ever enter into with lightly. Um, I made a personal vow from a very early point that I would never rely on tarot as a source of income, um, as a means to pay my rent and bills. I do charge for readings, but I do that on a sliding scale. I always talk to the person in question, find out what their financial situation is. If someone is so poor that they would be bankrupt by paying a small amount of money for a reading from me, I will either read for them for free or tell them that they, shouldn't pay me for a reading. Um, I usually, my personal practice in terms of charging is I usually tell people, okay, because for me it's psychological. What I've discovered is that um, people, so much of the challenge of giving someone reasonable advice as a tarot card reader, not crazy, deadly advice like, drink bleach and inject yourself with ivermectin or whatever it may be. Like, if you're giving someone what you believe personally to be reasonable advice on their situation, the hardest part generally is getting them to necessarily listen or take that advice seriously. Of course, it's always their prerogative if they're going to listen to anything that you say. But I've found that in terms of pricing, it makes sense to charge an amount enough to make them take the exercise seriously, to arrive at the divinatory encounter with I don't want to say solemnity, but a seriousness about the process. And I don't want it to feel disposable or something that you would do all the time. So I often tell people if they're a woman and regularly go to the salon, I say, how much does like a cut and color cost for you? Pay me that. Um, I don't think it's egregious and exploitative for me to ask somebody to pay me for my time the same amount that they would pay, to get a blowout or to get their hair colored. It's not so out of their means. Or I'll say, how much do how much would you pay normally for like an expensive meal at a restaurant? Maybe I'll ask twice that amount. Um, And then, it gives a weight to the encounter that I think is important if it's going to have some kind of psychological therapeutic value. And I do, and, the critics are right. There is a legion of diviners in the world providing counseling services completely unregulated. I am not a trained therapist of any kind. I make that really clear to all of my clients. Sometimes a reading will indicate psychological patterns or familial relationships that need work with a therapist. And I'll tell them, you paid me to divine. I'm not a therapist. I have to talk to them about what I see. And I my harm reduction as a reader, I don't read on medical issues. I don't make medical diagnoses. I'm not a doctor. That's madness. Um, and I think it's not an easy situation to be in because often I do feel like I reach a limit, in terms of what I am capable of doing for a particular individual. I can see that they're in a very vulnerable state emotionally. And usually I will just tell them, I can't read for you. Um, because I'm not relying on readings to support myself financially, that's easier for me to do. And it's by design. I don't want to ever feel like I don't want to ever feel compromised in that way. And I do think it would be compromising to be, you know, doing this work um, for set fees regularly to make enough money to live. It's something I knew from an early point that I never wanted to be in that position. Um, these days, I mostly read for, I have some clients that I've been reading for like 10 years, or longer. And even in the past, when I was reading at the flea market in South Africa, I had returning clients. And, you know, to the best of my knowledge, the clients who didn't return did not go off and, ruin themselves or make like life-threatening decisions. I don't feel like I've ever really told anyone anything that could put their life in danger. I don't feel like that's ever really come up. If I really think across the hundreds of, so much of what people are coming to ask about is really about their role in their life. Like it often ends up being much more about paying attention to patterns, personal patterns of behavior. And so it is a form of therapy. It is a form of, and occasionally I'll make predictions and I'll say, and I'll answer the questions that are asked. I've never had a client return to me. Maybe I'm really lucky in this way. In all these years, I've never had a client come to me and say, I followed your advice and it ruined everything. Like I did what you said and now my life is ruined. I mean, I have to be honest, it's possible there are people out there who went away and my advice, I can't tell you now in good conscience that my advice didn't ruin lives. But to the best of my sense of these things, I don't think that's happened because of the nature of the kind of conversations that clients and I have. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people. I know people. Yeah, I mean, I've had a number of clients who come to me because they went to another reader who fucked them up, who gave them increasingly dangerous or authoritarian advice, which they followed and got them to really like paranoid or bad place. Like I have a very close friend who started seeing back in South Africa, started seeing I don't know what they call them in the UK or the US, but in South Africa they call themselves kinesiologists. And I think in some contexts, kinesiology means something quite adjacent to biomedicine. But in South Africa, kinesiologists do muscle testing. And I think it's very popular now in the wellness scene. Like you test to see if your body really wants that food. And, he went when he was in his early 20s, I think, or mid 20s, she was recommended. And initially he went because he had some, eating issues and food aversions. And that was all it was meant to be about. But then she said, well, I'm a medium too. So, I can also tell you this and that. And by the end of it, she was basically dictating to him how he should proceed in his life, like that he should break up with his girlfriend, that he secretly hated his girlfriend in his body. And he was made to mistrust on a deep level his own intuition. I think that's a hallmark of dangerous readers, is that by design, they don't empower their clients. This is why I always emphasize that my clients should take responsibility. That before we even begin, I sit with them and discuss how to ask questions in a way that is going to give them more agency in their situation. And even if the answer is, you have very little room to maneuver here, there's still ways in which, there's agency in that. I have sometimes, but I mentioned before, clients who are kind of, I can see that they're addicted to divination. Um, there's only one time ever that I've lied to a client. Um, this was a woman who came to see me randomly on the curbside at the flea market, and she had so much sort of, I would see a lot of clients in South Africa who are very afraid that family members had bewitched them. Um, I really read deeply into those issues. I discouraged them from, I always tried to find out if there was something else they could ask about. But on every occasion that I have done a reading for somebody who's afraid of witchcraft, the cards have indicated that there was no witchcraft. There was no one who was trained in sorcery who had actively gone and performed. I mean, depends who your clients are, depends who you hang out with. But this woman, yeah, I could see she was very hostile and demanding. She said she had really important things with her in-laws to ask about, and I didn't want to read for her. So because I was young, I was too sort of didn't have enough. Now I would just tell her, I'm not reading for you for these reasons. But what I could quickly see that she had had many, she'd gone to many, always the same kind of interpersonal drama. And I did a reading for her. I took the reading seriously, but I could see in the cards that none of the problems that she was talking about were as inflated as she had made them, and that talking about curses and divination was probably going to worsen the situation. So I told her on that occasion, I said, look, these cards indicate that you should take a break from divination, that you should, and I gave her advice. I said, talk directly with your family, focus on relaxing, taking care of your health, and maybe come again in 6 months. She never did. But um, other than that, I always tell people, in terms of the question that they ask, what I see. I feel that that's my responsibility. Um, yeah, this point about seeding a reality in the client's mind is very true. It's a well taken point. I think it's true. I think it's absolutely true. I think to an extent that is the power of divination. That's why I think divination should be more transparent and collaborative. That's why I think there's nothing wrong with sitting with a client and explaining to them, they're always confirming, does it, do you relate to this? Does this make sense? Is this accurate, what I'm saying? And then you give them an alternative perspective. Um, like I said, 90% of the time clients say, I knew this already. I just didn't want to face it. It's the most common refrain. Sometimes, occasionally, you have clients who are just like, I absolutely don't get it. It's not, no, there's a block. But even those clients, when I think about them, I do feel like for me, my job is to remain true to whatever I see in the cards. I can't. There are times when, I explain this to clients. I will say, look, I'm telling you this now as a Buddhist or as a fellow practitioner, or here's advice that's just not from the cards, but I think it might be helpful advice for you. So yeah, in that sense, I'm being an unlicensed therapist. Um, they have agreed to listen to the advice I'm offering to them. Usually, people I read for now are within my own circles, because I don't advertise really. I used to have a website, but I don't advertise. Um, I just let word of mouth do its thing. And so for me, that's another way in which I can have some control over the kind of readings I do and who I do them for. If I feel like a person would be better served seeing a different type of therapist or a trained therapist or receiving some different type of care, or if I sense that, because, if I'm concerned that me doing a reading is going to worsen someone's projections or paranoia, I do a reading or I talk to other diviners or people, friends, and determine whether I feel like it's responsible to do a reading for at a particular request. A lot of the time, if I sense that a person is going through a lot at once, I actually won't read for them. I now like I said, my primary client at the moment is just people who seek me out because the advice I gave previously was useful to them. And then when something else comes up where they appreciate the perspective, just before this interview, a friend of mine who also reads tarot for others messaged me for a reading. So I also do readings for other readers, which I think many of us do that. Kind of like how counselors need their own counselors too. But yeah, I mean, it is, I can't deny any of the things that you're saying. Um, it's 100% true. There are a lot of vicious readers who are irresponsible and primarily seeking to exploit people. I mean, there's a tried and tested method. There's different names for it. It exists everywhere in the world. You go to a reader, they do a reading, you're there because some bad stuff's happening in your life, and then they're like, "Ooh, it's actually much worse than you thought. You're cursed. But to break this curse, now you're going to need to pay for this ritual. And oh, the first ritual didn't work. It was worse than I thought. So now you have to pay for this next ritual." It's a very common thing. Um, yeah, I don't really offer anything close to that. I don't claim. Usually, sometimes with my clients, an interesting thing has happened in recent years. For many years, I didn't always read for people who are very deeply involved in spiritual practice. But in the past 10 years, majority of my clients tend to be Buddhists, tend to be Buddhist practitioners. It's just because of the circles that I move in now. And that's interesting. It's like a different, or other occultists. And yeah, I think at most, what I do is I provide reading lists. That's what I'm more comfortable with. If somebody asks me a question about their spiritual development and the cards indicate that they have a talent in some area, I'll say, oh, well, here's a credible teacher who teaches that, or a good resource, and then I'll say you can read about that yourself. But again, to the best of my knowledge, that hasn't yet destroyed anybody's life. But I've seen it happen. I mean, I've had people reach out to me and say, I have a relative who had a really bad reading by a reader that really scared them. And when I had a reading with you, it wasn't like that. So maybe you should read for them. I'm never really sure if the answer in that situation is more divination. I usually turn down those kinds of requests. Um, I think that my clients generally tend to be stable and responsible these days. There's a kind of self-selection happening just in terms of the people that I meet. It was very different when I was just at a stand-up and literally people off the street came. Um, I don't think I would do that now. You know, the closest to that in recent years is I've done readings for friends have sometimes said, "Will you sit in my bedroom during my birthday party and just read for my friends, like by donation?" That's always interesting because people expect that I'm going to give them like a fun reading from the book, and then it's not like that at all. It's more serious. But they appreciate it in the end. Maybe not exactly the mood wanted at a party, but um, yeah. I have seen, I was just talking to a Tibetan friend recently who was telling me about Chinese and Tibetan people in China, um, who've spent thousands of dollars or a lot of money on consulting with different kinds of psychics and apparently just seeking something they weren't getting each time. Um, and actually, this same friend said she had only had one divination done by a lama early in her life. And the lama gave her a pretty good prognosis on most things. So she decided to not see any more diviners again because she didn't want to hear something different, let that affect how she lived her life. Um, she said another lama confirmed some of the diagnoses. in passing. And she was like, what? That's good enough for me. Um, it's a tricky thing that I think every diviner has to ponder, because the type of personality that comes for readings is often the type of personality that can be harmed by readings, because they're anxious, because they're vulnerable. So yeah, I completely understand. And so I have my own ways of trying to kind of deciding when and who I will read for. Um, but definitely I get it. I mean, it is a strange exercise, and it's not ideal to have unlicensed pseudo therapists just freely dispensing advice on major life issues. It's not ideal. Even if you feel like you're the best version of that thing, like you say, as an industry, it's not a it's not a net positive in most cases. I understand the critiques, and we've seen the casualties. They're undeniable. But I also have seen the incredible benefit, the amazing support that these procedures can provide. I mean, I do my readings from a vantage point of bodhicitta. I that's built into my practice, and yet I still worry about the things that you talk about. I worry about, like, I always have this feeling before I enter into any reading, like, who do I think I am? This is an outrageous proposition. This is an outrageous procedure. Like, maybe I should just, like, this, the weight of this is too much. It's too much responsibility. It's also, who do I think I am? But then, like I say, so far I have found that, provided you have some sense of how to relate to your clients in a responsible way, and when to know when to encourage them and refer them, um, that is at least harm reduction, I think. But yeah, it would be totally disingenuous of me as a reader, with all of the experience I have and everything I've seen, to say that it isn't a jungle out there, a jungle of unscrupulous, exploitative practitioners. And even practitioners who think they're doing good, just, yeah, can really hurt a lot of people. But so can
Well,
the advice of friends and family. Um,
and therapists and licensed therapists.
Therapists and licensed therapists, yeah. I've seen many people who have gotten terrible advice from therapeutic professionals and been really hurt by them. Some people come to the divination because they've been alienated in those other contexts too. It's not that they haven't tried them, it's that they haven't gotten the type of support that they wanted. Um, but yeah, so I don't, I don't know. In, does that answer your question?
Yes, I mean, if we say that of trained counselors, there are good ones and less good ones, and
Mm.
if you want untrained counselors working in a sort of medium of tarot, let's say, to the degree to which that can occasionally be counseling in a way, undoubtedly the best of those will be better than the worst of the trained therapists. We
Right,
could we could say it like that,
right,
um, because a certificate of training does not in itself guarantee quality, and nor does the absence of it guarantee incompetence. On the other hand, I could imagine a tarot reader one day recognizing that they're really doing a lot of counseling, really, and a lot of the sorts of mechanisms of benefit, such as listening and empathetic listening, positive regard, etc., are characteristics of good counseling.
Yeah.
I could see a tarot reader at that point thinking, really, what I'm doing is counseling, or really what I like to do is. I mean, I know some occultists who've gone that route actually.
Yeah,
Uh,
many do. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, many do. And it makes sense. But it's not identical. It's not
No,
identical.
no, it's not.
I mean, eliciting information about the past, present, and future is not identical to therapy. Because, I mean, this is the thing too. Tarot has become very therapeutic, right? In its style. Also, by the nature of its symbolism and the symbols that have been meshed together in the cards, they have this psychological that I always say the personality of tarot is all about the connectivity between levels of being. It's very much about like the way it expresses itself is very much about how internal experiences and processes relate to external things in a way that other oracles, in my experience, don't do that. So the language of tarot is sort of marked by a psychotherapeutic quality already. Um, and then also, you know, the Christian imagery was from morality plays. That's to our best understanding where it comes from. So a lot of that is folded in, but then, yeah, I mean, if you go to a Tibetan Lama and you bring your inquiry to them and they do a divination, usually they just give the answer and then you give them some butter or some money or what have you, and then you go off. You either follow their advice or you don't. Um, there isn't much talk about like how are you doing, what's your relationship like with your family. There isn't really that kind of social dynamic. The tarot card reader and the diviner in modern sort of tarot context are very close um, in terms of their socio-economic, you know, often you're reading for people who are more educated than you. I read for therapists. And that's interesting. I read for clients who are trained therapists. So they're clearly not just seeking therapy in that case. Um, but there is a parity between the modern tarot card reader and the client that isn't there in a lot of traditional cultural contexts. Um, and I think that also puts a lot of like it's a weird kind of thing because there's a lot of skepticism about tarot and it's seen more as for entertainment value. And because then there is also it's funny the permeation of psychotherapy throughout society, right, in all areas of life, has in a way made tarot more charged than it probably would be if it was done. And if there was a priest of tarot and you just went and you paid a small amount of money and then they just gave you your answer, then you just left. In a way, it gets a lot more messy because of the psychologization of much of modern life, and also because of um, that 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 closeness in terms of social status in a way or point of view between um, the reader and the client. Also, very few tarot card readers read while in a very deep state of trance. So that also means that even just in terms of their style of articulating the answers, you know, if I get deeply entranced and am possessed by a deity or a spirit, it's their words speaking the answer. It's not me couching the information in a particular way. It's not me developing a rapport. So, you know, something about the way in which, yeah, tarot has developed as an exercise has a uniquely psychological quality, which also makes it more, in some ways, because a lot of Tibetans will say, "Oh, okay, I'm going to ask the Lama if I should do that," and then it's like, "Yes, no," and then they're like, "Well, I'll try it, see what happens." You know, it's like there's not as much interpersonal engagement and investment there, you know. I have sometimes joked that I'm like envious of those shamans and diviners because whether, in a way, as a tarot card reader, whether you like it or not, you're actually thrust by the the nature of this modern form of divination into a kind of unregulated quasi therapeutic encounter necessarily. I mean, because if you were deep in trance, you wouldn't really be able to have, you don't have to worry about your bedside manner. You know, the spirit says what it says. Um, there's a different dynamic at play that I think has become almost like institutionalized in the style of tarot card reading, if that makes sense. It's interesting to think about as a historical development.
Yes, and it also makes me think of what is sometimes described as the psychologization or the therapeuticization of Buddhism, actually. That there are presentations of Buddhism, often by, by therapists or through a therapeutic lens, in a therapeutic culture. Some Buddhists will argue, well, I think the psychologization of Buddhism is missing the point. Buddhism is not therapy. It's about realization, etc. And using Buddhism for therapy is like using a fork to eat your soup. You can do it, but there are more efficient ways. Sometimes one hears that about Buddhism. So that's an interesting point, that in a therapeutic culture, tarot necessarily becomes the assumptions that everyone walking into that reading will have, both the reader and the client himself, herself, will be just automatically more that way inclined, which might then, as you say, obscure what tarot might have to offer outside of that set of presuppositions.
Well, a lot of tarot card reading, in my experience, is also, and this is, you know, of a piece with the therapeutic aspect that we're talking about, is also very confessional. You know, a lot of clients really just need to talk to somebody about the experiences that they're having, especially if those experiences are difficult to discuss with other family members or to make sense of if they involve like spiritual or paranormal experiences or whatever the case may be. Um, uh, yeah, I don't know. You know, like I had I have, like I said, primarily read for return clients, and I'm not a fool. I've wondered about what it is. Is it the predictions? Is it, you know, the, is it some other aspect of the encounter, of the therapy that keeps them coming back? Is it that they just like spending time with me? You know, that's also a possibility. I've thought about that a lot. Some people really want to talk through things. I've had regular clients. I had one client when I was younger who would come and he would always pay me 10 times what I asked. You know, I don't know why. He was a lawyer, but he would come to my house and he'd ask me very specific questions and I'd give him answers and he would not say a word. He wouldn't argue. He would just, he would come and then he would listen and he would go. Um, and, you know, I didn't ask him about his life beyond that encounter. You know, I sensed that he wouldn't have wanted to talk about it anyway. But everybody is different. Yeah, it's a very different kind of relationship. I often have clients, you know, not often, that would be an overstatement, but occasionally you have a client who's impressed by a reading and gets a lot of clarity or relief, and then they start messaging you and want you to tell them what to do in every instance. Um, just answer to be like a magic eight ball. And I have to explain that it's not what this is about. Like I was trying to help you. My hope is that I'll never see these clients again. Honestly, it is. Like in a good way. I always try to give them what they need to be self-empowered. That's how I conceive of this. I'm not interested in creating clients who are dependent, although I do have clients who come back. Life happens. Usually also I think it's fair to say that the majority of my clients are doing what His Holiness Dalai Lama suggests when it comes to divination, which is he says it's one means of getting information, and it should always be compared to other sources of information, and then a judicious decision should be made. And I would say in almost all cases, the clients that I have are thinking about their problems from many different angles. They are not relying solely on the information from the cards. By the point they've come to me, they've already thought through a lot of things. They've already made a lot of plans. They've already asked a lot of questions to other people. Um, yeah, I don't think they're not ill-considered decisions. It's like I said, maybe that explains why it's so common that clients say, "Oh, I already knew this," or "This is just confirmatory," because they've already been doing a lot of digesting and processing. Usually, if someone hasn't done introspection and processing and hasn't taken many points of view on their situation, they're probably unlikely to choose to come to a tarot card reader. I don't want to say that categorically, but like for me, the clients I get are usually quite thoughtful and have already digested their situation from a number of angles. Um, if you're also unexamined and you're in the midst of your reactivity, you're probably not at a point where you're like, maybe I should just check and see what a divination says, you know? Um, yeah, I'm trying to think about clients that I've seen. Yeah, I think a lot of clients are coming to me before they do the thing that they've already decided to do. I think it would be fair to say that. Not always. Although they think that maybe the answer is the thing that they didn't want to hear, and then they hear it from outside. Yeah.
That perhaps is a little bit in line with what you said before, that as a reader is to work with the client to craft the right sort of a question. So effort, and I think in general, in terms of divination and magical operations in general, a great deal of benefit is in the preparation, so it's said.
Well, I always say it is 50% at least of the remedy,
Right.
knowing what you need to ask. And I often I, I encourage my clients to actually fold their desired outcome into the question. So like, what do I need to do in order to accomplish X or avoid Y? And I find that's more effective too. Um, yeah, I mean, it also depends what kind of tarot card reader you are. Some people spend a lot of time reading for professional psychics and witches, in which case you could argue that there's more likelihood that they would actually be victims of malicious sorcery. Um, so some people do, most of my clients speak to me about spirituality, about relationships which have already failed. Probably the most common reading, if I had to look at all readings over the course of my time as a reader, it's relationships that have ended, and people are trying to understand exactly how or why that happened, what the roles were, what the behaviors were in that. Um, yeah, it's usually when the relationship is already bad, um, and they're getting closure from that. That's a very common type of client I have. People ask about business plans too, but usually not in terms of like, should I invest 50,000 in the stock market tomorrow? Because I'm like, I'm not gonna tell you to do something like that. Usually people ask me questions about like they're looking for a new career Um, they're trying to plot a way to move from one job to another. Um, it's often interpersonal situations in the workplace too. How do I best navigate this relationship with this boss who is this kind of way? Um, if I try this option, is it likely to be successful? What option might be more successful? Usually, in order to, get a result that they want. Um, I mean, you get all kinds of clients, but I would say love and business, and then also spirituality. Often people are just trying to understand how to live a meaningful life, you know. Um, a lot of clients have, yeah, they don't really know if what they're doing is right or and some it's not uncommon that their clients will say, well, what should I do to give my life meaning?
Mm.
And that's a very big question. And I'm saying, well, why are you asking a bunch of cards that, Can we talk instead about what you're doing now and what you're unsure about? And I'm just trying to give you information which you can decide whether to use or not, which will hopefully give you clarity about what you actually want or what your choices are. So I generally discourage people from asking those big questions like, what should I do? Or what is my purpose? But those are often the questions that people have, um, to a certain extent, what is all this about? That's what it comes down to for many people. What is the purpose of their life? Is their work meaningful? Are their relationships healthy, meaningful? Yeah. I think if I had to boil it down, that's what a lot of it comes down to.
Mm.
Sometimes people ask questions and they should know better. Recently, I have started occasionally seeing a type of occultist who comes for readings, um, who will have gone to many other mentors and readers who has told them, "Oh, you have this or that spirit in your life or in your court," and sometimes these clients are themselves training in how to be mediums, but then they want to ask about spirits and get backstory on spirits. And I say, even if you could prove whether any of this stuff I'm going to tell you is true, how is it valuable to you? It's not really valuable to you in terms of helping your training as a medium, because isn't the whole point that you are training to communicate with spiritual powers yourself? So then sometimes I think people just want confirmation of certain things. Sometimes they've developed a relationship with other diviners, and then maybe there's a part of them which is also thinking like, oh gosh, am I being led? Have I lost my own? Maybe there's a part of them, I don't know, that is concerned that they might be, like you said, being directed down a path, an interpretive drift. But I usually refuse to read on those types of questions. I say to people like, "What's the point of this? How is this helping you?" Um, I could put cards out and tell you what is said there, but is this valuable for you in terms of your training, or in terms of your life right now? I think some people, even people you think would know better, still treat divination as entertainment. They're like, I want to hear something weird and interesting and exciting. I have little time for that, really. I think it will always be therapy adjacent. Anthropologists have written so much about the shaman as the village therapist, as the person who's doing therapy in terms of maybe a different understanding, family, community therapy, not so individualized. Um, Increasingly, maybe you could say this is just because of who I am, but over the years, I've increasingly seen being for people that many of the problems that they believe are individual are connected to their family. I mean, it shouldn't be a surprising thing. But often the cards will want to say, like, what about your uncle who committed suicide from gambling debts? And then they'll say, well, I did have an uncle who did that, but I never thought it had anything to do with my career. And then you start talking to them, and then you realize that in some indirect but meaningful way, there has been a legacy in the family that they are carrying without even realizing it. And you could frame this as ancestral inheritances or ancestral curses. But I think that any therapist who spends long enough with a client will also discover that it's difficult to fully understand one person's life and lot in life if you don't have some sense of the stories that have been told around their family. And I do find that even when I'm not planning for it, some of this information comes up because that's what the divinatory snapshot is. It's showing you just a slightly wider set of connections and patterns and conditions than you would see through other means, including probably therapy. There's something more audacious about divination in that it says maybe these things are connected. And then the client has to wonder if that's true, to think about that possible connection. I have found, I don't know why, but I've found that tarot, this is part of tarot's personality. I very often see that the cards will tell clients, like, even though this is not connected to the problem directly, like you finding a job, when you resolve this other thing in your life, like the feud with your brother, or when you go back and visit your hometown or see your aunt's grave, things will shift. And it's like clients just have to, I don't know why these things come up. Clients will just have to decide for themselves whether these connections bear fruit. And, again, I can put on many hats. I can say, is this true? Or was it just therapeutic for that person to go back home? Did it to visit their grandmother's grave? Did this resolve some spiritual malaise? Did this correct an ancestral imbalance? Did this create the merit or the karma for them to shift this problem? There's many frameworks you can use for this thing. Or was it all a kind of psychodrama in which they decided to take my advice and were able to get out of some sort of point of view or pattern through these actions? I don't know. I don't know how I would ever know for sure, how I would test that. The whole point of tarot and divination is generally reframing anyway, re-narrativizing. How do you change the stories that people are telling about themselves and their life in a way that actually changes behavior? Like my friend who said, I don't want to see another diviner because I don't want to hear another story and be infected by that. Yeah. And I suppose in terms of your question, like, why not just become a therapist? It's a good question. I mean, I've thought about it a lot on a personal level. I'm like, I should just get some kind of accreditation, you know. But I'm also aware of the fact that tarot is not therapy. Whether you think it should exist, there will always be people who say, oh, it's superstitious, manipulative, and shouldn't happen. Shouldn't be monetized, you could say too. Like I said, I've come up with my own strategies for kind of what's the word? Regulating that side of things, like the frequency with which I do it for people, um, a non-fixed amount of money that I charge. Sometimes I do it in exchange for like a lunch or something, you know. I do feel like it's important for me to create an exchange where there's enough of a seriousness about the process because it changes the dynamic. Um, People usually don't value free advice. Strangely. I've also, this is another thing that we have spoken about, like, I've also wondered about this, like, getting an accurate psychic reading often actually has no value at all. Like, even when people told me that my predictions were accurate, it didn't seem to have actually changed anything. Um, Thus far, the most value I've seen in displays of clairvoyance is, like I mentioned earlier, just getting people to actually listen to the pretty common garden variety advice that might also come up in the divinatory encounter. Sometimes you're telling someone something that their friends or family could have told them or that they know would be useful to do, but they don't hear it until you tell them about how their boyfriend dresses in the morning, you know, and then they go, wow, you know, suddenly they're going to take the advice with a different weight. I have found that that tends to be where the actual practical, in the end, value of clairvoyant insight lies. I've met enough people who've displayed what to me has been remarkable clairvoyance, ability to foresee the future in frequently, as these things are, unreliable, strange flashes. And they really tend to be the most like, you know, clairvoyance doesn't seem to guarantee your ability to become the most powerful, rich, or famous, you know, successful person on earth if you look at the pattern. I think clairvoyance is something that crops up organically in certain situations. Some people have it sort of switched on constantly, but doesn't usually make their life easier or even other people's lives easier. It's often kind of a burden and an obstacle. I find in readings, it's those little moments of clairvoyance and demonstration of hidden knowledge that just wins over the trust of the client. Back to your point about is exploitation and where the value lies in divination. It's interesting though, because I'm I hadn't thought about this before, but persuaded by a convincing, genuine display of clairvoyance in previous readings, they're then going to be more likely to just listen to all of your advice on anything. You see this a lot with lamas, you know. Tibetan lamas might have some realization, some spiritual capacity. Then their students start taking their advice on every topic, areas that they're not really trained for. Um, so you also have to be very careful about that kind of dynamic too. Um, in my experience, once clients trust that you're a competent reader, like you have even more responsibility because each subsequent reading, they're probably more likely to listen to your advice um, without as needing as much persuasion. So it does create a very particular kind of dynamic. Any kind of position where you speak from a place of like spiritual authorities, you have to be very careful. You have to find ways to watch the power dynamic of the interaction. Yeah. I'm certainly not interested in becoming anybody's personal guru, that's for sure.
Issues of relationship with a client, power differentials, dependencies, transference, countertransference, and so on, we could think about are covered, of course, aren't they, in good counselling or therapeutic training. These are precisely the sorts of things that feature in good training in that field. Of course, there's bad training as well in counselling. We've all heard of these sorts of things as well. Yeah, sooner or later you have to reckon with these sorts of themes if you deal with people in any kind of advisory capacity.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think what I've seen with diviners is that they either have clients, regular clients who they're seeing a lot, and then, as you say, much in the guise, similar guise to a therapist. or they're seeing clients once off in very charged moments and never see them again. It it seems like those are the two extremes. Yeah.
The thing with lamas and the thing with clairvoyance is that, the clairvoyant, of course, presumably the assumption is that they have the capacity to access information that's not normally available. And the same, of course, is about a realized lama. The doctrinal idea there is that that realization isn't merely a kind of limited spiritual insight. It carries with it, if it goes high enough, a removal of all obscurations of ignorance, so the ability to see into the future, into the past, your past lives, your future lives, the tendril, the connections, etc., that are going on as a sort of byproduct of realization. There's that sort of a doctrinal assumption in certain sects.
And you also have the challenge that kind of doctrinally, lamas are not supposed to claim powers for themselves, or you automatically distrust it if you say you have omniscience or you have attained Buddhahood by your own reckoning. So then you have a doubly tense kind of situation where people are ascribing fairly or unfairly omniscient knowledge. That person is denying it strenuously, and then there's no clarity in the middle.
Right.
I've never really understood this idea, because if everyone's guru was a Buddha and that meant that they were actually omniscient, why would we need any other gurus or any other doctors or engineers or people with any form of knowledge that was specific professional knowledge? Surely your guru would be a one-stop shop. But I don't believe that that's what's being pointed to in this exercise, Guru Yoga. I mean, what do I know? But I don't think that seeing Buddha nature in another person to discover your inner qualities or capacities means that now that person can fulfill every role, can have the same knowledge or expertise in every area of life. Lamas still go to mechanics and lamas still go to doctors. Why did the Buddha have a doctor? He had a personal physician. Why did, he still seek out that kind of expertise if he was omniscient? It's an interesting question. But I mean, that's kind of, it's not unrelated to what we're talking about, but certainly I think what's so interesting about this Wild West of diviners is that, like we said, tarot isn't even a singular tradition with one sort of standardized procedure. There is a kind of pattern, like I say, there's a kind of development that's happened. Form of divination. But I don't even know the half of what's going on out there. I mean, like I say, I just open TikTok and I'm quite horrified, actually. And people are at the readings that people are doing with so glibly and kind of so freely for absolute strangers. And just the amount of outrageously crazy things that people are saying. Yeah. I mean, we could talk as well about legality around divination, because in many countries there still are some form of anti-mediumship or anti-divination laws, which have created interesting. They have been protested, like in South Africa, they've been protested as unconstitutional, and is actually compromising people's uh, freedom of religion because they were British colonial laws, fraudulent medium laws, and then now have subsequently kind of expanded in the South African context to um, include anyone who professes to provide divinatory services, which includes most Izangoma, African traditional healers. Um, and they complained. Neo-pagan witches in South Africa also complained, um, saying the bills were unconstitutional. But then, of course, that also opened the door to how do you regulate the training of shamans and diviners. I mean, in South Africa, Izangoma have their own quite grueling procedures of training, and they have to do demonstrations of clairvoyance. They're tested regularly throughout their training. Um, but, the training is so idiosyncratic. It happens from mentor to students. There's no standardization. I briefly looked into the South African government's attempt to bureaucratize and standardize the training of Izangoma, herbalists, Izinyanga. There are organizations of traditional healers, administrative organizations that represent traditional healers' rights. There was some talk several years ago about creating a kind of basic exam. But the reality is that when you look at the methods used by shamans and diviners, they're so idiosyncratic, even within one ethnic group. They're kind of antithetical to standardization by their kind of nature. The government was saying that each traditional healer had to list a certain minimum number of plants by their colloquial and Latin binomial names and say what they use those plants for. But even that is like, when we're talking about ritual healing, even the way you categorize how one plant is understood as being like or similar to another plant, it's not based on things like active chemical ingredients. Also, whether a plant will cure a patient's illness isn't necessarily based on it just being that plant. Maybe the ancestors appear to a shaman the night before and they say, you must harvest that particular version of that plant that we will show you growing next to the river, and then say prayers and prepare it this way. That will heal the patient. You can't just go to the shop and buy the same species. So we're dealing with forms of knowledge that are very difficult to reorganize according to legal bureaucratic requirements. I don't really know what the state of, I know that at least since 2007, South African diviners and traditional healers are no longer criminalized. Because up until that point, I mean, there are thousands of diviners and traditional healers in South Africa. But up until that point, they had been criminalized. No one was actually, police weren't, unless there was some major crime, like a murder for human body parts for ritual medicine or something involving traditional healers or herbalists or some kind of, undeniable malpractice. Police weren't really just going in and criminalizing diviners, because most police in South Africa have diviners in their family, have shamans in their family. But yeah, I mean, regulating these issues all around the world is an incredibly vexed question. And it has been for centuries. It's especially tricky because diviners are often the people in many contexts that are identifying witches and then are arguing against them. In the UK context, in the past, many of the people who identified witches in witch trials were cunning folk, white witches, healers and herbalists, whose job was to divine for others. and sometimes identify the existence of malefic sorcery and give remedies for that. But they were also involved, interestingly, they were sometimes at the receiving end of criminalization, of legalization, but they would also sometimes be involved in pointing out the witches and bringing them to legal justice. So yeah, it's a long, complicated history. I don't actually know what the current state of the UK Fraudulent Mediums Act is. I think as recently as only a few years ago, a medium was charged under it with fraudulent mediumship. Yeah.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, Ben. Thank you very much indeed. I look forward to a sequel. And in that sequel, we might talk then about divination in other contexts, other cultural contexts, different methods, modalities, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot I could say about Tibetan approaches to divination. I think it's interesting because Buddhism is both, in some ways you could say Buddhism is anti-divination, but it's also very supportive of divination. There's countless forms of Buddhist divination, and my own understanding of divination has changed as I practice Buddhism to some extent, definitely.
Well, then perhaps we'll talk about that, as well as the other means of divinatory information that can occur. Dreams, for example, is one, and other things like that. That would be very, very cool indeed. Well, great. I look forward to it. Dr. Ben Joffe, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.